Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily, just for you. The long, winding road stretched before Julia like a serpent slithering through the dense woods. The farther she drove, the more her cell phone signal flickered until it finally vanished altogether, leaving her completely disconnected from the modern world. She let out an exasperated sigh, glancing at the GPS on her dashboard, which was now frozen, the little blue dot hovering somewhere in a sea of green. She had been driving for hours, leaving behind the city she loved, her cozy apartment, and all the comforts of modern life. But this journey was a necessity. Her Aunt Lydia's unexpected death had left Julia the sole inheritor of a remote cabin deep in the forests of Maine, a place she hadn't even known existed until the lawyer called with the news. Julia had vivid memories of her eccentric aunt, a woman who always seemed to live on the fringes of society, preferring the company of trees and birds over people. Aunt Lydia had been estranged from the family for years, drifting off to this isolated cabin after some sort of breakdown. The family had assumed she was just chasing another one of her whims, but no one had anticipated she'd die alone, her body discovered weeks later by a passing hiker. As Julia's small sedan rounded a final curve, the forest opened up to reveal the cabin. It was larger than she expected, 2 stories, with a sloping roof covered in moss, the wooden structure weathered and darkened by time. The cabin looked like it had grown straight out of the ground, as though it were a natural part of the forest itself. It stood alone, surrounded on all sides by towering pine trees, whose branches reached out like skeletal arms, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the fading light. Julia parked her car on the gravel path, the crunch of the tires loud in the otherwise absolute silence. Stepping out, she was immediately enveloped by the earthy scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. There was something unnervingly quiet about this place. No chirping birds, no rustling animals, only the faint whisper of the wind threading through the trees. Julia couldn't shake the feeling that she had stepped into another world, one that had been hidden away from the rest of civilization. She walked up to the front door, the wooden porch creaking under her weight. The key the lawyer had sent her fit perfectly into the rusty lock, and with a turn, the door groaned open, revealing a shadowy interior. The smell of dust and age rushed out to meet her, and Julia wrinkled her nose. Fumbling for the light switch, she flicked it on, but nothing happened. The cabin was dark, lit only by the faint, watery daylight seeping through the grime-covered windows. "Great, no electricity," Julia muttered to herself. She would have to check the fuse box later, assuming there was one. For now, she was grateful she'd brought a flashlight. She pulled it from her bag, clicking it on, and swept the beam around the main room. The cabin was a time capsule from another era. Everything was old, wooden, and covered in a layer of dust. A few antique chairs, a moth-eaten rug, and a fireplace filled with charred logs dominated the space. A thick layer of cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams, swaying gently in the draft. As she explored further, she noticed that despite the general state of decay, everything was oddly undisturbed, as though her aunt had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Dishes were neatly stacked in the kitchen sink, a half-burned candle sat on the dining table, and a dusty book lay open on the armrest of an old recliner, as if Aunt Lydia had just put it down moments ago. Trying to push down the creeping unease settling into her bones, Julia made her way down a narrow hallway that led to the bedrooms. At the very end was the door to what she assumed was the master bedroom, but when she tried the knob, it refused to budge. She pushed harder, but it was locked tight. She'd have to find the key later. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye, a faint movement by the window. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Swiveling her flashlight toward the window, she saw nothing. Just the trees beyond, their dark forms swaying slightly in the wind. "Get a grip, Julia," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her breathing. It was just the shadows playing tricks on her. Returning to the main room, she decided it was time to get settled. Julia unloaded her bags, finding some comfort in the mundane tasks of unpacking. But the feeling of being watched gnawed at her, a persistent sensation she couldn't quite shake. She tried to convince herself it was just nerves. After all, she was alone in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by nothing but miles of dark forest. By the time she finished unpacking, the sky outside had turned a bruised purple, the sun slipping behind the horizon. Julia realized with a start that she hadn't brought any food, so she'd have to make do with the few cans she found in the pantry. As she heated up a can of soup on the gas stove, she heard it again, that sound. A faint rustle, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. She paused, the spoon halfway to her mouth, straining to listen. The sound came again, this time accompanied by a soft, rhythmic thudding, like footsteps approaching. She set the spoon down and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The beam from her flashlight barely penetrated the thick blackness beyond the porch. She could see nothing but shadows. But the feeling was unmistakable. Now something was out there, just beyond the edge of the trees, watching her. Heart racing, Julia backed away from the window, every instinct screaming at her to lock the door. She bolted the front door shut and drew the dusty curtains tight, trying to block out the encroaching night. She told herself it was just her imagination. It had to be. The forest was full of animals, after all, and she was just on edge from being alone in a strange place. But as she tried to settle into the old recliner with her bowl of soup, she couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin was too quiet, the shadows too deep. Somewhere in the darkness outside, something was waiting, and it knew she was here. The morning sun filtered weakly through the dirty windows, casting jagged patterns of light and shadow on the wooden floors of the cabin. Julia awoke in the old recliner, stiff and groggy. She hadn't meant to fall asleep there, but exhaustion had overtaken her, though it was hardly a restful night. Her dreams had been plagued by fragmented images, trees reaching out like claws, whispers echoing through the darkness, and glowing eyes staring from the shadows. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. The cabin was cold, and she could see her breath as a faint cloud in the morning chill. The fireplace, which had died out hours ago, still emitted a faint smell of burnt wood. Julia decided to make herself a cup of instant coffee and figure out what she was going to do next. First on the list was getting the power back on, assuming it was more than just a blown fuse. As she rummaged through the kitchen drawers looking for a flashlight battery, her fingers brushed against something crinkly and brittle. She pulled it out, a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It seemed out of place among the random utensils and expired food packets. The paper felt fragile, like it might disintegrate if handled too roughly. Unfolding it carefully, she discovered a handwritten note scrawled in shaky, uneven letters. "Don't go out after dark. He watches, always." The words sent a shiver down her spine, the ominous message stark against the faded paper. Julia turned the note over, hoping to find more, but that was it. The note was unsigned, leaving her with no clue as to who had written it or when. She tried to tell herself it was probably just her aunt's way of trying to scare off trespassers, or maybe a prank by some local kids. But the handwriting looked shaky, desperate, like someone had scribbled it in a hurry. And that single word always stuck in her mind, echoing like a warning she couldn't ignore. Setting the note aside, Julia went back to searching for anything that could help her get the power back on. In a dusty cupboard beneath the sink, she found an old flashlight and, to her relief, a box of matches. Gathering her resolve, she decided to investigate the basement, hoping the fuse box was down there. The basement door was hidden behind the kitchen pantry, its frame warped with age. It groaned in protest as she forced it open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into pitch darkness. The smell of damp earth wafted up from below, cold and musty. Julia hesitated. Every horror movie she'd ever seen flashed through her mind, warning her not to go down there alone. But she needed light, and there was no getting around it. Gripping the flashlight tightly, she started down the creaking stairs. Each step felt like it might give way beneath her weight. The air grew colder as she descended, the temperature seeming to drop with each step. The flashlight's weak beam revealed dirt walls reinforced with wooden planks, cobwebs hanging like curtains from the ceiling. Finally, reaching the bottom, Julia swept the light around the space. The basement was cluttered with old rusted tools, crates, and an ancient-looking furnace. The fuse box was on the far wall, its metal surface pocked with rust. As she made her way toward it, the flashlight flickered and sputtered, plunging her into darkness. "Come on," she muttered, shaking the flashlight until the beam returned, though weaker now. She made it to the fuse box, opened it with a loud creak, and found a jumble of tangled wires and switches. It took her a moment to figure it out, but with a bit of fiddling, she managed to reset the circuit. A faint hum filled the air as the power came back on, and the single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered to life. Relieved, she turned to head back upstairs. That's when she heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the far corner of the basement. It was so faint she thought she might have imagined it, but then it came again, a raspy sound like dry leaves brushing against one another. "Is someone there?" Julia called out, her voice echoing in the confined space. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. She held her breath, straining to hear any movement, but there was nothing, just the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Julia hurried up the stairs, shutting the basement door firmly behind her. She tried to brush it off as just her nerves. After all, this place was old and full of drafts. But that whisper had felt wrong, like a voice that didn't belong to any living thing. Back in the kitchen, she poured herself another cup of coffee to steady her nerves. As she sat at the small, wobbly table, her eyes wandered to the note again. This time, she noticed something she hadn't before. At the bottom of the page, almost invisible against the yellowed paper, were faint indentations, as if someone had pressed down hard with a pen. Grabbing a pencil, she shaded over the indentations, hoping to reveal what had been written. Slowly, the ghostly outlines of words began to appear. "He comes with the dark. Stay inside. Don't trust the woods." Her heart skipped a beat. The new message seemed to have been written beneath the original warning by the same shaky hand. Julia's mind raced with questions. Who was he? What did they mean by "don't trust the woods"? The whispers, the strange noises, and the sense of being watched, all of it seemed to be connected. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of scratching at the front door. It was slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across the wood. Julia froze, her eyes widening as she stared toward the door. The scratching stopped, followed by a soft, almost inaudible tap, 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 as if something was testing the strength of the door. Summoning what little courage she had left, Julia crept toward the front window. She pulled the curtain back just a fraction of an inch and peeked out. There, standing just beyond the porch in the morning mist, was a dark silhouette. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and utterly still, almost like a shadow that had stepped away from the trees. Its face was hidden, but Julia could feel its eyes on her, watching. A deep, primal fear welled up inside her. She let the curtain fall back into place and retreated into the house, her heart racing. She grabbed her phone, hoping to call for help, but there was still no signal. The cabin's isolation, once merely inconvenient, now felt like a trap. The note's warning echoed in her mind, "Don't go out after dark. He watches, always." Julia knew one thing for certain. Whatever it was, it had found her, and night was coming. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Julia had spent the hours huddled in the corner of the living room, flashlight gripped tightly in her hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. Every creak of the old cabin sent her heart racing, and each gust of wind that rattled the windows made her jump. The scratching at the door had eventually stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow worse. By the time the sun began to rise, its pale light spilling through the grimy windows, Julia's nerves were frayed. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been outside was still watching, just beyond the reach of the morning light. She took a deep breath and tried to gather her thoughts. She couldn't hide in the cabin forever. If she was going to survive here, she needed to understand what was happening. But first, she needed to check outside to see if there were any signs of last night's visitor. Grabbing her coat, Julia cautiously unbolted the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The crisp morning air hit her face, clearing her head and giving her a brief moment of clarity. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of frost under her boots as she walked down the steps. The light was thin and watery, casting long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the clearing in front of the cabin. As she took her first step into the clearing, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, in the thin layer of snow and frost that covered the ground, were deep, unmistakable footprints. Julia's breath caught in her throat. The prints were enormous, each one easily twice the size of her own feet, and they were barefoot. The sight of those naked prints in the freezing November ground sent a chill down her spine. No human could walk barefoot in this weather without leaving blood behind, but there were no signs of blood, only those deep, deliberate impressions. The footprints circled the cabin, trailing all the way around the perimeter like something or someone had been pacing outside, looking for a way in. The prints were strange, the toes elongated and almost claw-like, leaving deep grooves in the frozen ground. They seemed wrong somehow, like a distorted parody of human feet. Swallowing hard, Julia followed the trail. The prints led from the front door, where she had heard the scratching the night before, around the side of the cabin, and then veered off into the dense forest. The trees seemed to close in around the trail, their branches arching overhead like the ribs of some ancient beast. The farther she followed the footprints, the darker it seemed to get, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the thick canopy above. Julia hesitated at the tree line. The woods looked even more forbidding in the daylight, the underbrush dense with tangled roots and skeletal bushes. The footprints continued, disappearing into the shadows. She could feel the forest almost beckoning her to follow, but something deep inside her screamed to turn back. Reluctantly, she heeded that instinct. The note she had found kept flashing through her mind. Don't trust the woods. Turning on her heel, she quickly made her way back to the cabin, her heart pounding with each step. As she neared the safety of the porch, she noticed something she hadn't seen earlier. On the wooden steps, right next to where she had been standing, was a small object, half buried in the frost. Kneeling down, she picked it up. It was an old, tarnished locket. She recognized it immediately. It had belonged to her Aunt Lydia. She remembered seeing it in old family photos, the delicate silver pendant hanging around her aunt's neck. But what was it doing out here? Julia's mind raced. Aunt Lydia had lived in this cabin for years, keeping it hidden from the family. What had she been running from? And more importantly, had she truly escaped whatever it was? The presence of the locket felt like a message, a warning left behind for Julia to spy. She hurried back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind her and bolting it once again. She placed the locket on the kitchen table and sat down, her mind spinning with questions. There had to be answers here somewhere, something that would explain what was happening. She needed to know what her aunt had been hiding from all these years. With a newfound sense of determination, Julia decided to search the cabin more thoroughly. She went back to the locked room at the end of the hallway, the one she hadn't been able to open the day before. The door still refused to budge, but this time Julia was prepared. She found a small crowbar in the basement and used it to pry the door open. The wood splintered with a loud crack, and the door swung inward. The room was dark and musty, with a thick layer of dust covering everything. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There was a small bed pushed against one wall, its mattress covered in mildew, and a rickety wooden desk covered with old papers. But what caught Julia's attention was a large wooden chest in the corner, its surface scratched and scarred. She approached it cautiously, feeling a strange sense of foreboding. The lock was broken, so she lifted the lid, the hinges squealing in protest. Inside were stacks of old journals, each one covered in Aunt Lydia's familiar handwriting. Julia's hands trembled as she picked up the first journal and opened it. The entries were dated from years ago, and the writing grew increasingly erratic as the pages went on. Her aunt had documented everything: strange noises, mysterious visitors in the night, and sightings of a shadowy figure lurking at the edge of the forest. Flipping through the pages, one entry caught Julia's eye. "He is getting closer. I see him more often now, standing at the edge of the trees. He never moves, just watches. I've tried to warn the others, but they think I'm crazy. They don't understand. He feeds on fear. He waits for the dark. He wants me to be alone." Julia's heart pounded as she read the words. Her aunt's paranoia suddenly didn't seem so unfounded. And then in the final entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, was a single line that made Julia's blood run cold. "He knows I'm weak now. He knows I'm alone. I can't keep him out much longer." Julia snapped the journal shut, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The pieces were starting to fit together, but they painted a picture far worse than she had imagined. Whatever had haunted her aunt hadn't died with her. It was still here, lurking in the shadows, and it had now turned its attention to Julia. A sudden loud thump echoed through the cabin, shaking the walls. Julia jumped to her feet, her pulse racing. The sound had come from the roof, like something heavy had landed there. Her mind raced back to the footprints, the strange noises, and the shadowy figure she had glimpsed in the woods. Whatever this thing was, it was getting bolder. Julia grabbed the crowbar, her only weapon, and braced herself. The thing on the roof moved again, its footsteps slow and deliberate, as if it were searching for a way in. And then, from somewhere above, she heard that same low, raspy whisper from the basement. "I know you're there." Julia's blood ran cold as the whisper turned into a soft, sinister laugh that echoed through the cabin. Julia stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the sinister laughter from above faded into silence. The sound seemed to seep into the walls of the cabin, making it feel alive, as if it were breathing around her. Clutching the crowbar like a lifeline, she backed into the hallway, her eyes darting between the doorways, half expecting something to leap out at her from the shadows. The whispering had stopped, but now the cabin was filled with an even more oppressive silence. Like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Julia needed to get a grip. Panic would only make things worse. She forced herself to breathe slowly, focusing on the task at hand, figuring out what her aunt had been hiding. Whatever was haunting this place, Aunt Lydia had clearly known about it. The journals she had discovered in the small, locked room provided some clues, but there was more here. She could feel it. There were secrets buried in this cabin, secrets her aunt had gone to great lengths to conceal. Julia was determined to uncover them. She couldn't leave until she understood what was stalking her, and more importantly, how to stop it. Her eyes fell on the old wooden desk in the corner of the room, covered in dust and cobwebs. It was littered with papers, some crumpled and torn, others neatly stacked. The air around it was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Julia cleared a spot and began sifting through the contents, her hands trembling slightly. There were letters from family members, old utility bills, and pages torn from books, most of them nonsensical scribbles about shadows and the Watchers. One letter, dated nearly a year ago, caught her attention. It was addressed to a man named Dr. Samuel Morton, a name Julia didn't recognize. The letter read, "Dr. Morton, I've tried the sedatives you prescribed, but they are no longer helping. The visions are getting worse. He is always there now, just beyond the trees. I can feel him inside my mind, feeding on my fear. I know you don't believe me, but you must understand, this is not a hallucination. He's real, and he won't leave until he gets what he wants. Please, I'm begging you, find a way to stop him. Time is running out." The letter ended abruptly, as if her aunt had been interrupted. Julia's hands shook as she folded the letter. Dr. Morton had clearly been some kind of psychiatrist, but whatever treatment he had offered hadn't worked. Aunt Lydia had been tormented, driven to the edge of madness by whatever this entity was. Setting the letter aside, Julia continued searching the room. Behind the desk, almost hidden in the shadows, she found a small metal box. It was locked, but the lock looked old and fragile. Using the crowbar, she pried it open with a loud snap. Inside was a single item, an old, worn Polaroid photograph. Julia held the photo up to the dim light. It showed a younger Aunt Lydia standing in front of the cabin, smiling. But something was wrong with the picture. In the background, just beyond the tree line, was a figure, a dark silhouette, tall and gaunt. The figure was blurred, almost like it was vibrating, as if it didn't quite belong in this world. Its eyes were two pinpoints of light, glowing faintly in the black and white photo. A chill ran down Julia's spine as she stared at the figure. It was the same shadowy entity she had seen outside her window on her first night here, the same one that had left those grotesque footprints around the cabin. Whatever it was, it had been haunting her aunt for years, slowly driving her mad. Her hands shaking, Julia flipped the photograph over. There was writing on the back in her aunt's frantic scrawl. "He can't enter without permission, but he can still reach you. Don't let him in." Before Julia could process the words, a sudden, deafening crash echoed through the cabin. It sounded like glass shattering, followed by a rush of cold air. Heart racing, Julia bolted out of the room, and the sound had come from the living room. When she got there, she stopped short. The large window beside the front door was completely shattered, shards of glass scattered across the floor. The cold wind whipped through the room, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and decay. Julia's eyes scanned the chaos, searching for any sign of an intruder. Then she saw it on the floor. In the middle of the broken glass was another Polaroid photograph. It hadn't been there before. Someone or something had thrown it through the window. Cautiously, Julia picked it up, her fingers trembling. This photo was different. It was taken at night, the cabin barely visible in the background. But standing in the foreground was the same shadowy figure. Only this time, it wasn't alone. There was another figure beside it, Julia herself, standing on the porch, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. Her blood turned to ice. This photo wasn't taken years ago, it was taken last night. A sudden, loud knock echoed from the front door, making her drop the photo. It wasn't the gentle tapping she had heard before. This was forceful, demanding, as if someone was trying to break down the door. Julia backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. The door rattled on its hinges, and Julia could see the old wood splintering under the force. Gripping the crowbar, she stepped back, her mind racing. Then she remembered the words on the back of the first photo. He can't enter without permission. She had to keep him out. Whatever was trying to break in couldn't enter unless she allowed it. That realization gave her a sliver of hope, but only just. The door was old and weak, and she could already see cracks forming near the lock. Thinking quickly, Julia grabbed the bag of salt she had found in the kitchen pantry earlier. She wasn't sure if it would work, but she had read somewhere that salt could ward off spirits. Frantically, she poured a line of salt across the threshold, praying it would hold. The knocking stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was silence. Julia held her breath, the air around her heavy with tension. Then, from the other side of the door, came that same raspy whisper she had heard in the basement. "You can't hide forever, Julia." The voice was closer now, clearer, as if it were speaking directly into her ear. Julia clenched her jaw, refusing to let the fear consume her. She wasn't going to let this thing win. Slowly, the whisper faded, replaced by the sound of footsteps retreating into the forest. Julia waited, barely daring to breathe, until she was certain it was gone. Only then did she collapse to the floor, her entire body shaking. She knew now that whatever was haunting her wasn't just a ghost. It was something far worse, something that could manipulate reality itself, and it was getting stronger. Julia glanced at the shattered window, the salt line on the floor, and the photographs strewn around her. The cabin was filled with secrets, and the more she uncovered, the closer it seemed to draw her into its dark embrace. She needed answers, and fast. Grabbing one of the old journals, she began to flip through it desperately. Somewhere in these pages, Aunt Lydia had to have left a clue about how to stop this thing, because if Julia didn't figure it out soon, she knew it was only a matter of time before the thing outside found a way in. Nightfall came quicker than Julia anticipated, the shadows lengthening as if the forest itself were conspiring to swallow the last slivers of daylight. She had spent the remaining daylight hours barricading the broken window with old wooden boards she had found in the basement. The salt line across the door was now joined by several others, at every window, threshold, and even the fireplace. She didn't know if it would be enough, but she was running out of options. The cabin had become a fortress, the once cozy atmosphere now replaced with a cold, foreboding tension. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of wind outside set her nerves on edge. As darkness descended, a suffocating stillness settled over the woods, as though every living thing had gone silent, waiting for the night's inevitable horrors. Julia sat in the center of the living room, the old journals spread out around her like a desperate student cramming for an impossible exam. Her aunt's scrawled notes were increasingly erratic, filled with drawings of twisted figures and cryptic messages about the creature she had only referred to as the Watcher. The entries painted a terrifying picture. Aunt Lydia had tried everything to escape it, charms, rituals, even consulting psychics. But nothing had worked. The Watcher always returned. It thrived on fear, its power growing with each encounter. One journal entry, dated just a few weeks before Lydia's death, stood out. He grows stronger with every visit. It's like he feeds on my terror, my loneliness. He waits until I'm at my weakest. I can't keep the door closed much longer. But the ritual, perhaps it can buy me time. I just need to gather the right ingredients. Julia's eyes scanned the list scribbled underneath the entry. It was a mix of common items like candles, salt, and herbs, alongside more obscure ingredients she had never heard of. She didn't have half of what was required, but maybe, just maybe, she could improvise. The idea of attempting a ritual terrified her, but if it was her only chance of keeping the Watcher at bay, she had to try. The old clock in the hallway struck midnight, its chime echoing eerily through the cabin. Julia's heart skipped a beat. Midnight. The hour when the barrier between the worlds was said to be thinnest. She couldn't help but wonder if that was why the Watcher chose this time to come. As if in answer to her thoughts, there was a sudden, slow, deliberate knock on the front door. Julia's blood ran cold. She held her breath, waiting to see if it would come again. The knock was soft, almost polite, but there was something in its cadence, something calculated, patient. It was as if the thing outside knew she was listening, knew it had her undivided attention. Knock, knock, knock. The sound reverberated through the cabin, louder this time, as though it were challenging her to respond. Julia's hands shook as she reached for the crowbar she kept beside her. She didn't move toward the door. Instead, she backed away, keeping her eyes on the salt line she had poured earlier. It was still intact. "Go away," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You can't come in. I won't let you." The knocking stopped, replaced by a long, eerie silence that felt like the whole world had paused to listen. Julia strained her ears, hoping to hear the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. But there was nothing, only the oppressive stillness pressing in on all sides. Then a voice came, soft and seductive, from the other side of the door. "Julia, let me in. I'm so cold out here." The voice was unmistakable. It was her mother's voice, warm and familiar, tinged with a note of pleading. But Julia's mother had died years ago in a car accident. She knew this, yet the sound of her voice, so real and so close, sent a flood of conflicting emotions surging through her. For a moment, the terror ebbed, replaced by a desperate, irrational hope. "Mom?" Julia whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Is that really you?" "Yes, darling," the voice replied, soft and reassuring. "It's me. Please open the door. I've missed you so much." The thing outside began to scratch at the door again, softly, almost lovingly, as if caressing it. Julia clenched her eyes shut, her rational mind screaming that it was a trick. She knew the rules from the journal. You can't come in without permission. It wasn't her mother. It couldn't be. But the voice was so convincing. The way it said her name, the slight tremor that her mother used to have whenever she was scared. For a split second, Julia's resolve wavered. Her hand inched toward the door handle. Then she remembered the photograph. The one where the shadowy figure had stood beside her likeness, as if it had already claimed her. She snatched her hand away from the door, as though it were burning. "No," she said, louder this time, her voice shaking. "You're not her. You're not real." A guttural growl of frustration came from the other side, and then, with a sudden, deafening crash, something heavy slammed against the door, shaking the entire cabin. The hinges groaned, and the wood splintered. Julia stumbled backward, her heart racing. She had never heard it so desperate, so angry before. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the assault stopped. The cabin was plunged into an unnatural silence, even more terrifying than the noise. Julia waited, her breath ragged, gripping the crowbar so tightly her knuckles turned white. She couldn't hear anything, not the wind, not the usual creaks of the old house. It was as if the entire world had gone still. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Then, just when she thought it was over, she heard it. A soft, wet sound, like something dragging itself across the floor. Julia turned toward the sound, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room. There, emerging from the shadows near the broken window, was a hand long and skeletal, with fingers that ended in sharp, blackened claws. The hand gripped the windowsill, pulling a grotesque form into view. The watcher was no longer content to wait outside. Its eyes, two burning pinpoints of malevolence, locked onto hers. It was tall, almost scraping the ceiling, its limbs twisted and unnatural, as if it had been broken and put back together wrong. Its face was a grotesque mockery of a human, with hollow sockets that oozed darkness. Julia's mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. She could only watch in paralyzed horror as the watcher dragged itself through the broken window, the salt line there somehow smudged, allowing it to slip inside. Desperation seized her. The ritual. She had to try the ritual her aunt had written about. Dropping the crowbar, Julia fumbled for the journal, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. The watcher inched closer, its breathing a harsh rasp that filled the room. She found the page and quickly began to recite the incantation, her voice wavering. As she spoke, the air in the room seemed to change, growing thick with a heavy electric charge. The watcher paused, tilting its head as if it were listening. But it didn't retreat. Instead it smiled, a grotesque, impossibly wide grin that split its face from ear to ear. "That won't work, Julia," it whispered, its voice a distorted echo of her mother's. "Your aunt tried the same thing, and look where it got her." Julia's hands trembled, her voice faltering. The words of the ritual blurred together in her mind, her terror overwhelming her concentration. But she had to finish. She had to. It was her only chance. Drawing a deep breath, Julia shouted the final words of the incantation, her voice echoing through the cabin. For a moment, the creature recoiled, its form flickering like a broken hologram. The lights in the cabin surged, then went out completely, plunging her into darkness. There was a scream high-pitched and furious, like metal tearing, but then nothing. The silence returned, and when Julia opened her eyes, the watcher was gone. But the cabin felt different now, heavier, darker, as if something had changed. Julia's relief was short-lived. The ritual had only bought her time. She knew the watcher would be back, and next time it wouldn't be alone. The power didn't come back on. Julia stood in the pitch-black cabin, her heart pounding as she struggled to catch her breath. The sudden darkness was suffocating, like being swallowed by the forest itself. Her flashlight flickered feebly before going out completely. leaving her with nothing but the sound of her own ragged breathing. The Watcher was gone, but the oppressive feeling it had left behind clung to the air like a thick fog. It hadn't been defeated, only driven back. Julia could feel its presence lingering, just beyond the walls, waiting for the right moment to strike again. In the cold, choking darkness, Julia fumbled for the matches she had left on the kitchen table. She struck one, the small flame sputtering to life and casting flickering shadows on the walls. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped it. She quickly lit an old oil lamp she had found earlier in the basement, filling the room with a dim, warm glow that barely seemed to push back the darkness. She was running out of time. The ritual had bought her a reprieve, but she knew the Watcher would return, angrier and more determined than before. Her aunt's journals hinted at a solution, but the fragmented entries were frustratingly vague. Somewhere in these old, yellowed pages, Aunt Lydia had left the key to stopping the Watcher. Julia just had to find it before it was too late. Grabbing the pile of journals, she carried them into the living room and dumped them onto the floor. She couldn't afford to be methodical anymore. She had to find answers quickly. With the oil lamp flickering beside her, she began tearing through the journals, flipping through page after page of desperate, scribbled notes. Aunt Lydia's handwriting grew more erratic, the deeper Julia delved, reflecting her increasing paranoia and fear. The early entries were filled with mundane observations about life in the cabin, but over time they became darker, more frantic. Sketches of twisted figures filled the margins, accompanied by cryptic messages about shadows that moved when no one was looking. One entry, dated 2 months before Lydia's death, caught Julia's attention. "He is growing bolder. Last night, he almost made it inside. I saw his hand reach through the crack in the window. The salt line kept him back, but only just. I can feel him in my mind now, whispering things, trying to wear me down. I am losing sleep. I am losing strength. I don't know how much longer I can hold him off." Julia shivered. The same thing was happening to her now. The Watcher was relentless, wearing her down bit by bit. She had to find the key to stopping it before she too succumbed. As she flipped to the next page, something strange caught her eye. Tucked between 2 pages was an old, faded map. It was hand-drawn, depicting the area surrounding the cabin. There were strange symbols marked at various points, circles, crosses, and what looked like ancient runes. One symbol, a large circle drawn in red ink, was centered deep in the woods, far from any path or trail. Beneath the map was a hastily written note. "The ancient circle. The stones are older than time itself. If I can reach it, if I can perform the final ritual there, I may be able to banish him for good. But I am too weak now. I cannot make the journey alone." Julia's pulse quickened. This was it, the answer she had been searching for. The circle marked on the map was a place of power, a spot where Aunt Lydia had believed she could banish the Watcher once and for all. But she had been too frail, too worn down by years of torment. Julia didn't have years, she had hours at best. She knew what she had to do. The ritual she had attempted in the cabin was only a temporary measure. If she wanted to end this nightmare, she had to go to the ancient circle in the woods. It was the only place where she could draw enough power to banish the Watcher. But the thought of venturing into the forest, alone and at night, filled her with dread. The woods were no longer just trees and shadows. They were alive, a hunting ground where something ancient and malevolent waited for her. She had seen it in the glimpses she caught at the edge of the tree line, the dark shapes that shifted when she wasn't looking. Still, there was no other choice. The cabin was no longer safe, not after the Watcher had breached its walls. If she stayed here, it would only be a matter of time before it found a way in again, salt lines or not. Julia grabbed a backpack and began throwing in everything she might need. Matches, candles, salt, the map, and a knife she found in one of the kitchen drawers. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Before she left, she took one last look at the journals. She needed one final clue, something to guide her once she reached the circle. In the last journal, she found a page that was more lucid than the rest. as if Aunt Lydia had written it during a rare moment of clarity. The ritual must be done at midnight when the veil is thinnest. The circle of stones will protect you, but only if you light the sacred fire. He will try to break your focus, to trick you with illusions, with the voices of those you love. Do not listen. Do not look away. You must finish the incantation, no matter what. Julia closed the journal, her resolve hardening. The Watcher would try to deceive her, to prey on her deepest fears. But if she was going to survive this, if she was going to banish it once and for all, she couldn't afford to hesitate. Steeling herself, she pulled on her coat and strapped the backpack to her shoulders. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, as if the forest itself sensed her intentions. She pushed the door open, the cold night air slapping her in the face. The darkness beyond the cabin was thick, impenetrable, but she had no choice but to walk into it. The moon was a faint sliver in the sky, offering little light as she made her way through the underbrush. The trees loomed over her like silent sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. Every step she took seemed to echo unnaturally, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the oppressive silence. The forest felt different now, more alive, as if the trees were watching her. She could feel eyes on her from the darkness, hear the faintest rustle of leaves as if something were trailing her, just out of sight. But she forced herself to keep moving, following the map by the light of her flickering flashlight. Finally, after what felt like hours, she reached a small clearing. The ground here was different, the air colder. In the center of the clearing stood a circle of ancient stones, half buried in the earth, their surfaces covered in strange, worn symbols. This was it, the place Aunt Lydia had marked on the map. Julia stepped into the circle, the air inside feeling heavier, almost electric. The shadows seemed to writhe just beyond the stones, but for now they kept their distance. She set up the candles, pouring a circle of salt around the stones, just as the journal had instructed. The air was thick with tension, as if the entire forest were holding its breath. As the clock on her watch ticked closer to midnight, she began the incantation, her voice barely more than a whisper. The wind picked up, swirling leaves and debris around her, but she kept her focus. She had to finish the ritual, no matter what. Then from the darkness beyond the stones came a soft, familiar voice. "Julia, it's me. Please don't do this, you'll die out here." It was her father's voice this time, filled with desperation and fear. Julia's heart wavered, but she clenched her jaw, refusing to look up. The Watcher was trying to break her concentration, just as her aunt had warned. She couldn't afford to listen. The shadows pressed closer, the voices multiplying, but Julia's focus didn't waver. She shouted the final words of the incantation, her voice rising above the howling wind. The air inside the circle seemed to shatter like glass, a blinding flash of light erupting from the stones. The Watcher let out an ear-piercing scream, a sound that was both human and inhuman, as its form twisted and contorted. For a moment, it seemed to disintegrate, breaking apart into tendrils of shadow that were pulled into the earth. And then, just like that, it was over. The wind stopped, the voices faded, and the forest fell silent once more. Julia collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, the ancient stones still humming faintly with residual energy. She had done it. She had banished the Watcher. But as she rose to her feet, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A single set of footprints leading away from the circle. And they were hers. Julia stared down at the footprints, her own, leading away from the circle. They were fresh, as though someone had just walked away moments ago. But she hadn't moved. Her heart pounded in her chest as the implications sank in. Was she losing her mind? Had the Watcher somehow tricked her? Or worse, was it now mimicking her movements? The clearing was eerily silent, the air heavy with a strange, oppressive stillness. Julia's breath came out in shallow gasps, misting in the cold night air. The ancient stones surrounding her seemed to pulse faintly, still echoing with the energy of the ritual she had performed. But whatever protection they had offered was fading fast. Clutching her flashlight, Julia took a tentative step forward. following the footprints that mirrored her own. The forest loomed like a living thing, the trees twisted and gnarled, their shadows stretching like claws across the ground. The sense of being watched was stronger than ever, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. The footsteps led her deeper into the forest, away from the safety of the stone circle. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't afford to ignore this. If the Watcher had somehow found a way to mimic her, then it was more powerful than she had imagined. She needed to understand its tricks, its weaknesses. Otherwise, she would never truly escape. The deeper she ventured, the thicker the fog became, coiling around her like a living thing. The air was filled with the faintest whispering, just at the edge of hearing, as if the trees themselves were speaking in some ancient, forgotten language. The sound was maddening, like hundreds of voices murmuring secrets just beyond her reach. As she pushed through the underbrush, the whispering grew louder. It was coming from all around her now, an unending stream of half-heard words that sent chills down her spine. Julia paused, shining her flashlight in a slow circle. The light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, the beam barely penetrating the dense fog. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Her words were immediately devoured by the forest, the whispering voices rising in response. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. But when she turned to look, there was nothing there. The footsteps she had been following abruptly stopped at the base of a massive ancient oak tree. The bark was blackened and twisted, its branches stretching overhead like skeletal arms. Julia shone her flashlight down at the ground, where her footprints seemed to vanish into the roots of the tree. "What the hell?" she muttered to herself, her breath hitching. She reached out, almost instinctively, to touch the rough surface of the tree. The moment her fingers brushed against it, a cold shock shot up her arm, and everything went dark. Julia stumbled back, the world spinning around her. She was no longer standing in the forest. She was somewhere else. The air was thick, heavy, filled with a sickly metallic scent. It was as if she had been transported to a place that existed just beyond the edges of reality. The ground beneath her feet was no longer earth, but something soft, spongy, and wet. She turned slowly, the flashlight flickering, as if it were struggling to stay alive in this strange, alien realm. The trees here were wrong-twisted, gnarled things that pulsed with a faint, sickly glow. The whispering was louder now, so loud it seemed to echo inside her skull. "Julia!" Her voice was unmistakable. It was her father's again, the same voice she had heard outside the cabin. But this time it was closer, more desperate, as if he were trapped somewhere just out of reach. "Dad?" Julia called out, spinning around. "Where are you? Please help me, I'm so cold." The voice sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to let herself be tricked. She remembered her aunt's warning. He will try to break your focus, to trick you with illusions. This was another one of the Watcher's tricks. It was trying to draw her deeper into its realm, to make her vulnerable. But she wasn't going to fall for it. Clenching her jaw, Julia forced herself to ignore the voice and focus on her surroundings. She needed to find a way back to the real world before it was too late. As she walked, the fog seemed to part ahead of her, revealing a small clearing. In the center of it stood a figure, a tall, dark silhouette, just like in the photographs. But this time it wasn't standing still. It was moving toward her, slow and deliberate, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Julia's flashlight flickered again, threatening to go out completely. Panic rose in her chest as the figure drew closer. It was the Watcher, but its form was more solid now, less like a shadow, and more like a twisted, nightmarish version of a human. Its limbs were elongated, its joints bending at unnatural angles, its face a grotesque mask that seemed to shift and change with every step. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Julia raised her flashlight and aimed it directly at the Watcher's face. The creature let out a guttural hiss, recoiling from the light as if it were a physical blow. For a moment its form flickered, as though it were struggling to hold itself together. But then it lunged. Julia screamed, stumbling backward as the creature's clawed hands reached for her. The flashlight slipped from her grasp, plunging her into darkness. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, filling her mind with a torrent of chaotic voices. "Let me in, Julia, let me in." Blindly, she reached into her backpack, her fingers closing around the knife she had packed. As the watcher closed in, she lashed out, feeling the blade connect with something solid. The creature shrieked, a sound that was both human and inhuman, a horrible mix of rage and pain. The impact sent her reeling, but she managed to scramble to her feet. The watcher was writhing on the ground, its form flickering between shadow and flesh. This was her chance. Without thinking, Julia turned and ran, not daring to look back. She had no idea where she was going, only that she needed to get away from that thing. The fog seemed to close in around her, the air growing colder with each step. Her lungs burned, her muscles screaming in protest, but she kept running. Suddenly, the ground beneath her gave way, and she tumbled forward, falling through darkness. For a moment, she was weightless, spinning through a void where time and space had no meaning. And then, just as suddenly, she hit solid ground, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She gasped, opening her eyes to find herself back in the real forest. The ancient oak tree loomed above her, its bark glistening with a strange, oily sheen. She was out. She had made it back. But as she staggered to her feet, her relief was short-lived. The forest around her was no longer silent. It was alive with movement. Shadows darted between the trees, and the air was filled with the sound of whispering voices, all calling her name. The watcher wasn't gone. It had brought something with it. Julia's heart sank as she realized the horrifying truth. By entering its realm, she had opened a door. And now, it wasn't just the watcher that was after her. The entire forest was waking up. Julia's heart pounded in her chest as the realization settled in. The forest was alive. Whatever dark energy she had stirred up in the ancient circle had not only drawn the watcher's attention, but had awakened something far older, something that seemed to inhabit the very bones of the forest. The air was thick with an almost palpable malevolence, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. Gasping for breath, Julia pushed herself up from the ground, her legs trembling. The strange fall through the darkness had disoriented her, but she couldn't afford to waste time. The forest was no longer a passive observer, it was hunting her. The shadows shifted unnaturally, darting between the trees, their movements erratic and chaotic, like predators that had caught the scent of blood. She had one chance left, the final ritual her aunt had mentioned in the journals, the one that needed to be performed at the ancient circle, with specific items to banish the watcher for good. But she was running out of time, and her path back to the circle was blocked by the shifting, restless forest. The ancient oak tree behind her creaked ominously, as if it too were alive and watching her. Julia forced herself to move, stumbling through the underbrush, clutching her backpack like a lifeline. She had to get back to the stone circle. The only way to close whatever door she had inadvertently opened was to finish what her aunt had started. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it that terrible, raspy whisper. "You can't escape, Julia. You're mine now." It was the watcher's voice, but it wasn't alone. The whispers overlapped now, dozens, maybe hundreds of voices all calling her name in a twisted chorus. Each voice was familiar, a cruel imitation of her loved ones, friends, even her childhood self. They were trying to wear her down, to break her spirit. But Julia was beyond fear now. She was desperate. Fumbling in her backpack, she pulled out the items she needed. The last remnants of the salt, the candles, the small knife, and the crumpled piece of paper with her aunt's final incantation scrawled on it. Her hands shook as she checked to make sure everything was there. She couldn't afford to miss a single step. If the ritual failed, there would be no second chance. The journey back to the stone circle felt like a nightmare. The path she had taken earlier was gone, swallowed by the forest that now seemed to twist and shift around her, intentionally disorienting her. The trees closed in, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The fog thickened, reducing her vision to just a few feet in front of her. Julia stumbled forward, her flashlight flickering weakly, barely enough to cut through the oppressive darkness. The whispers grew louder, so loud they seemed to vibrate inside her skull. The ground beneath her feet was soft and treacherous, as though the earth itself were trying to swallow her whole. Suddenly the forest opened up, and she found herself back at the stone circle. Relief surged through her, but it was quickly replaced by dread. The circle looked different now. The ancient stones that had once stood as silent sentinels were now covered in dark, pulsing veins, like some grotesque mockery of roots. The air inside the circle was thick with a foul, metallic scent, as though the ground itself was bleeding. "It's not too late, Julia." The voice came from the shadows beyond the circle, that sickeningly sweet imitation of her father's voice. "You can end this. Just let me in." Ignoring the voice, Julia rushed into the center of the circle and dropped to her knees. She began arranging the candles, her hands shaking as she poured a thick line of salt around the perimeter. The whispers surged, the voices becoming desperate, angry. "She can't do it," one voice hissed, followed by another. "She's weak, just like the other one." Julia's mind flashed to her aunt, huddled alone in this very circle, trying and failing to banish the Watcher. But she couldn't afford to think about that now. She had to finish the ritual. She couldn't let fear break her focus. The air inside the circle began to vibrate as she lit the candles one by one. The flame of each candle sputtered, as if struggling against an unseen force. The darkness pressed in closer, the shadows writhing just beyond the salt line like hungry beasts kept at bay. Taking the knife, she hesitated for only a second before slicing a shallow cut across her palm. Blood welled up, warm and red, dripping onto the earth. The moment her blood touched the ground, the stones seemed to hum with energy, the air around her growing colder. Clutching the blood-stained knife in one hand and the incantation in the other, Julia began to chant the words her aunt had written. The ancient language was foreign to her tongue, each syllable heavy and unnatural, as though the words themselves were fighting to remain unspoken. The shadows outside the circle erupted in fury, swirling like a storm. The Watcher's voice rose above the cacophony, no longer attempting to imitate her loved ones. "You think you can stop me, little girl? You are nothing. I have devoured souls for centuries. You are nothing but a flicker, a brief moment of terror. I will feast on you, just as I did your aunt." Julia's voice wavered, her concentration faltering. The Watcher's taunts cut deep, preying on her fears, her self-doubt. But then she remembered Aunt Lydia's final desperate entry. "Do not listen. Do not look away. You must finish the incantation, no matter what." With renewed resolve, she continued to chant, her voice growing stronger with each word. The wind howled louder, the forest seeming to tremble as if in pain. The Watcher's screams turned into a deafening roar, shaking the ground beneath her. But the salt circle held, the candles flaring brighter as if fueled by her defiance. As she reached the final line of the incantation, Julia lifted the bloodied knife and drove it into the ground at the center of the circle. The earth beneath her erupted with a burst of light, so blinding she had to shield her eyes. A shock wave rippled outward, knocking the twisted shadows back, their screams of rage fading into the distance. The air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting as though a massive hand had been pulled away. For a moment, everything was silent. Julia opened her eyes, blinking away the after-images. The ancient stones stood silent once more, their strange veins gone. The candles flickered weakly, the last of their flames dying out. She had done it. The Watcher was gone, the forest was still, the whispers silenced. But as Julia stood, her legs trembling with exhaustion, she noticed something strange. The air inside the circle was colder than before. And then she heard it, faint but unmistakable. "You may have closed the door, but it is never truly shut." A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the light of the dying candles. It was not the Watcher. This was something else. Something darker, something ancient that had been stirred from its slumber. The ritual had banished the Watcher, but in doing so, Julia had inadvertently drawn the attention of something even worse. She had won the battle, but the war had just begun. The clearing was deathly silent, the oppressive darkness pressing in on all sides like a living thing. Julia stood in the center of the ancient stone circle, her knees weak, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She had performed the ritual. She had driven the Watcher away, or so she had thought. But now, something far worse had awakened. The air around her was colder than before, biting through her jacket like icy knives. The shadows that had once lurked at the edges of her vision now seemed to ripple, shifting and reforming. Whatever she had called forth was no longer bound by the Watcher's grasp. The ritual had torn the veil, and now the forest was alive with a new, more ancient darkness. As she scanned the trees, Julia's flashlight flickered weakly, the beam sputtering like a dying ember. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized that she was not alone. Dozens of glowing eyes stared back at her from the darkness, watchful, hungry, and filled with an intelligence that was far colder and more calculated than the Watcher's malevolence. A whisper, barely audible, slithered through the trees. "You have opened the gate, and now you will pay the price." The voice was unlike the taunting, mocking tone the Watcher had used. This was deeper, more ancient, resonating through her very bones. Julia's hands shook as she gripped the knife, its blade slick with her own dried blood. She turned slowly, trying to keep the flickering flashlight steady, but it was useless. The shadows moved too quickly, darting just beyond the reach of her light. And then she saw it. Emerging from the darkness was a figure, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated beyond the limits of human anatomy. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were hollow voids, filled with a darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure's face was grotesque, a twisted parody of a human visage, as if someone had tried to sculpt the face from melting wax. Julia's breath hitched in her throat as the figure took another step forward. The air around it crackled with an unnatural energy, the ground beneath it blackening with each step. This wasn't the Watcher. This was something older, something that had been slumbering deep beneath the forest's roots, waiting for a fool to disturb its eternal rest. "You thought you could banish me?" The thing's voice was a low rumble, like the grinding of ancient stones. "You only freed me from my prison. The Watcher was my servant, a puppet to lure you here, and now you belong to me." Julia's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was hearing. She had thought the Watcher was the source of her terror, the entity that had tormented her aunt. But this thing had been controlling the Watcher all along, using it to weaken her, to draw her deeper into its web. "Why?" Julia managed to choke out, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why me?" The creature's grin widened, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "Because you have opened the gate, little one. Your blood was the key. You are the vessel, the bridge between worlds." The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her blood, used in the ritual, had not just banished the Watcher, it had unlocked something far worse. It had drawn this ancient entity into her world, binding it to her. The forest around her had become a living nightmare, a reflection of the darkness she had unleashed. The creature reached out with one of its grotesquely long arms, its fingers ending in claw-like tips that seemed to shimmer with a dark, oily substance. Julia staggered backward, her flashlight finally sputtering out, leaving her in complete darkness. "Stay back!" she screamed, thrusting the knife in front of her. But the creature only laughed, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through the ground beneath her feet. "You cannot stop me, child. Your aunt tried, and look where it got her. She thought she could seal me away, but she only delayed the inevitable." Julia's thoughts flashed back to the journals she had read, to her aunt's desperate attempts to keep the entity at bay. The Watcher had been a guard, a sentinel meant to keep the real horror contained. But Lydia's ritual had weakened over time, and Julia's arrival, her blood, had been the final crack in the seal. The shadows around her began to pulse and writhe, as if they were alive, drawn to the creature like moths to a flame. Julia could feel them pressing against her, suffocating her with their cold, slimy touch. She couldn't breathe. The darkness was closing in, tightening like a noose around her throat. But then in the chaos, she remembered the last thing she had read in her aunt's journal. One desperate entry stood out. The only way to seal it for good is to bind it with a living soul, a sacrifice. The ritual is incomplete without it. Julia's heart sank. That was why her aunt had failed. Lydia hadn't been able to go through with it. She couldn't make the ultimate sacrifice. But now Julia was faced with the same choice. To end this nightmare, she would have to bind the creature to herself, sealing it forever in a living vessel. Tears streamed down her face as she realized what she had to do. There was no one else to help her. If she didn't stop it here, the darkness would spread beyond the forest, consuming everything in its path. Summoning every ounce of strength left in her, Julia grabbed the knife and with a shaky hand pressed it against her chest. The creature paused, its eyes narrowing in confusion. "What are you doing?" it hissed, its voice filled with a rare note of uncertainty. "I'm finishing what my aunt started," Julia whispered, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "You want a vessel? You'll have one." With a scream that came from the depths of her soul, she drove the knife into her own heart. The world seemed to explode in a burst of light and sound. The ground beneath her feet shook violently, and the air was filled with an ear-piercing shriek as the creature's form began to distort, collapsing in on itself. Julia's vision blurred, the edges of her consciousness fading as pain tore through her body. But she didn't let go. She held on, focusing every ounce of her willpower on the ritual. She could feel the creature's dark energy pouring into her, trying to fight its way out, but she wouldn't let it escape. She was the seal now, the barrier that would keep it trapped. As the last of the creature's power flooded into her, the shadows around her began to recede. The forest, once alive with malice, grew still. The whispering voices faded into silence, and the oppressive darkness lifted. Julia collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, the knife still protruding from her chest. She was alive, but only just. The entity was inside her now, bound to her soul, trapped within her flesh. She had done it. She had sealed the gate. But as her vision faded to black, she heard one last whisper, soft and mocking. "You think you've won, little one, but darkness is patient, and you are only human." Julia's eyes fluttered shut, the cold earth embracing her as she slipped into unconsciousness. The forest was silent now, the air clear and still. But deep within her, something ancient and malevolent stirred, waiting for the moment when it could break free once more. The nightmare was over, for now, but the darkness would never truly be contained. And somewhere deep in the woods, the watcher's eyes blinked open again. Darkness enveloped her. Julia drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind lost in a hazy void. She was aware of nothing except a faint, steady pulse like the heartbeat of some monstrous, ancient creature. Every beat sent waves of pain radiating through her chest, where the knife still protruded. The world around her was a blur of cold and shadows, but somewhere in the depths of her fading mind, she knew she was still alive. Barely. She had won the battle, but the victory came at a terrible cost. The ancient entity, bound to her by the ritual, seethed inside her soul, clawing at her mind like a trapped animal. It whispered cruel taunts, mocking her, reminding her that it was only waiting, biding its time. "You are weak," it hissed in her thoughts, its voice like shards of glass. "Sooner or later you will break, and then I will be free." But Julia wasn't ready to give up, not yet. With a sudden, desperate gasp, she forced her eyes open. The world around her came into focus in disjointed fragments, the twisted trees, the cold, damp earth beneath her, the ancient stones of the circle standing like silent guardians in the mist. She was back in the clearing. The forest was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. The knife was still embedded in her chest, but somehow, impossibly, she was still breathing. The pain was excruciating, each breath a struggle, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her moving. She pulled herself up on trembling arms, gasping as fresh pain lanced through her. The ritual had succeeded in binding the entity, but it was a temporary solution. She was the vessel now, the seal. The entity was trapped within her, but only as long as she had the strength to hold it. If she faltered, if her will wavered, the creature would break free, and the horrors she had witnessed would pale in comparison to what it would unleash upon the world. But she wasn't alone. There at the edge of the circle stood a figure cloaked in shadow. It was the Watcher. The creature's gaunt form was hunched, its glowing eyes watching her with a mixture of curiosity and hunger. It no longer taunted her with whispers or tried to frighten her with illusions. This was different. It was waiting for her to fail. "You," Julia gasped, her voice a mere whisper, each word burning in her throat. "You're still here." The Watcher tilted its head, its expression unreadable. The entity inside her stirred, recognizing its former puppet. There was a strange connection between them, something that Julia couldn't fully understand. "Yes," the Watcher finally spoke, its voice a low, resonant growl. "You have taken my master's place, but you're weak, human. You cannot contain it for long." Julia's vision blurred, her strength fading. The knife in her chest was a constant, agonizing reminder of what she had done. But she couldn't let go. She couldn't let the darkness loose again. She had to end this. "Why are you still here?" she demanded, gritting her teeth against the pain. "What do you want?" The Watcher's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Julia saw something that almost resembled hesitation. "I was bound to serve it," the creature rasped, its voice heavy with centuries of bitterness. "But you have severed that bond. You are the seal now, the prison." The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. The Watcher was no longer a servant, it was free. But instead of leaving, it had chosen to stay. Why? What did it want now? "Help me," Julia whispered, a desperate plea escaping her lips before she could stop herself. "Help me keep it locked away. If I die, it escapes." The Watcher's glowing eyes flickered, its twisted face contorting in what might have been a grimace. "You are asking for an alliance?" it sneered. "After all your kind has done?" Julia didn't have the luxury of pride. She was dying, and the ancient entity inside her was waiting for its chance to break free. "You hate it," she said, her voice hoarse. "You hate being its puppet. But if it escapes, you'll just be its slave again." The Watcher was silent, its gaze fixed on her. Then slowly it stepped forward, crossing the line of salt that had once kept it at bay. Julia's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had no other choice. "Very well, human," the Watcher growled, its voice low and cold. "I will bind myself to you. But know this, if you falter, if you show weakness, I will not hesitate to claim your soul myself." Julia nodded, too exhausted to argue. She could feel the entity inside her raging, its whispers turning into screams as the Watcher approached. The creature reached out with one of its long, skeletal fingers, touching the knife embedded in her chest. The moment its clawed hand made contact, a searing pain shot through Julia, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to scream. The Watcher began to chant in a low, guttural voice, words in a language that felt older than the forest itself. The air around them vibrated with dark energy, and Julia could feel the entity inside her thrashing, trying to break free. But the Watcher's chant grew louder, stronger, weaving a binding spell that would link it to Julia, reinforcing her strength. For a moment it felt as if the world itself had stopped. The shadows around them writhed, the air thick with a force that was almost tangible. And then, with a final guttural shout, the Watcher drove the knife deeper into Julia's chest, sealing the bond with her blood. The pain was excruciating, but it was also liberating. The presence of the Watcher flowed into her, not as an enemy, but as a reluctant ally. The entity inside her screamed in fury, but it was no longer strong enough to break free. The combined force of Julia's will and the Watcher's ancient power held it in place, sealing it away. The forest fell silent once more. The oppressive darkness lifted, the trees no longer twisted and malevolent. The bond was complete. Julia collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, her vision swimming. The Watcher stepped back, its eyes narrowed, observing her with a cold, predatory interest. "You have bought yourself time, human," it said, its voice a low growl. "But do not mistake this for victory. The entity will continue to fight you from within, and I will be watching." Julia nodded weakly, knowing the truth of its words. She was now bound to two monsters, one within and one beside her. But for now, she had survived. The Watcher turned, its form dissolving into the shadows of the forest. It was free, but its bond to her meant it would never be far. She was the prison now, the seal that kept the ancient darkness contained. As Julia stumbled out of the clearing, the forest was eerily quiet. She knew her life would never be the same. She was no longer alone, but she was not free either. She was the guardian of a darkness that would never truly die, a constant battle that she would have to fight every day, every hour, for the rest of her life. But for now, the whispers were silent. For now, the Watcher was at bay. And for now, the darkness slept within her. The rain was relentless, hammering down on the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. The wipers struggled to keep up, swiping back and forth at full speed, but still, visibility was poor. Jason gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. The old highway was nearly deserted, stretching out like an endless black ribbon through the night, illuminated only by the dim glow of his headlights. It was the kind of night that felt like it would never end. Jason had been on the road for hours, trying to make it to his sister's house a few towns over. It was supposed to be a quick drive, but the unexpected storm had slowed him down. Now, it was well past midnight, and the GPS on his phone kept cutting out. With nothing but the hiss of rain and the drone of the engine to keep him company, Jason was starting to feel the fatigue set in. As he rounded a curve, the faint glow of a figure appeared on the side of the road. A person? Out here in this storm? Jason squinted, trying to get a better look. It was indeed a person, a woman, drenched from head to toe, her dark hair plastered to her face. She stood on the shoulder, one hand feebly raised in a gesture of desperation. Jason hesitated. He'd heard all the stories about picking up strangers, but something about her seemed different. Maybe it was the sheer hopelessness in her stance, or the fact that leaving someone out here in the middle of nowhere felt too cruel. Against his better judgment, he slowed the car and pulled over. As the passenger side window rolled down, the woman leaned in, her eyes shadowed beneath the drenched hood of her coat. "Can I get a ride?" Her voice was soft, barely audible over the sound of the rain. Jason nodded. "Hop in." The woman slipped into the seat, closing the door with a heavy thud. For a moment, the car was filled with the damp smell of rain-soaked earth. Jason glanced at her, but she was already turned away, staring out the window. The only sound was the rhythmic patter of rain against the car roof. "Where are you headed?" he asked, trying to make conversation. "Just ahead," she replied vaguely. Her voice was distant, almost hollow. Jason shrugged, figuring she must be exhausted or in shock. He decided not to press her for details. The road stretched on, and they drove in silence for what felt like hours, the rain never letting up. Every now and then, Jason stole glances at his passenger. Her clothes were old-fashioned, the kind you'd expect to see in a black and white photograph. He thought it was odd, but said nothing. After a while, he started to feel a chill in the air, as if the temperature in the car had dropped several degrees. He turned the heater up, but it did little to dispel the cold. The woman remained still, her eyes fixed on something unseen beyond the glass. Finally, a gas station sign appeared in the distance, its flickering neon lights a welcome sight. Jason pulled off the highway, thinking he could use a coffee to wake himself up. He turned to ask the woman if she needed anything, but she was gone. The passenger seat was empty. Jason slammed on the brakes, his heart hammering in his chest. There was no way she could have gotten out. He hadn't even heard the door open. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what just happened. Maybe she had slipped out when he wasn't looking, but how? And why didn't he hear anything? Confused and shaken, he parked by the gas station and stumbled inside. The clerk, an older man with a grizzled beard, looked up from his newspaper. "You all right there, buddy? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a half smile. Jason took a deep breath and recounted the story, hoping to make some sense of it. The clerk's expression grew grim, and he nodded slowly. "You're not the first to pick her up," the old man said. "That woman died on this highway over 20 years ago. Some say she still tries to get home, especially on nights like this." Jason felt the blood drain from his face. He stumbled back outside, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his keys. He quickly got back into his car, determined to leave that place behind. As he pulled back onto the highway, the rain seemed to ease up slightly, almost as if the storm had been satisfied. But Jason couldn't shake the feeling that he was still being watched. Every time he glanced in the rearview mirror, he half expected to see her sitting there, her dark eyes staring back at him. But there was nothing. The rest of the drive was a blur, the road unfurling endlessly before him. When he finally reached his sister's house and staggered inside, soaked and exhausted, the sun was just beginning to rise. But for the rest of his life, every time it rained, Jason couldn't help but remember that chilling ride and wonder if, somewhere out there, she was still waiting for another unsuspecting driver to pick her up. End of Chapter 1. The sound of rain continues, fading slowly to a gentle, calming rhythm to help the listener relax and drift off to sleep. Then Mark called down, "There's nothing here." His voice was steady but tinged with something, relief maybe, or perhaps a hint of doubt. Emily exhaled, her tension easing slightly. But just as she was about to turn away, she heard it again, that unmistakable sound of footsteps. This time they were heavier, more deliberate, and coming from directly above her. "Mark," she called, her voice quivering. "I hear it again!" Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. There was a silence so thick it pressed against her ears. Then a blood-curdling scream echoed from the attic. Without thinking, Emily rushed up the stairs, fear tightening her chest. She burst through the attic door to find Mark standing there, his flashlight beam shaking as he pointed it toward the far corner. Emily followed his gaze. There, half buried beneath a pile of old boxes, was a door they had never noticed before, small and almost invisible against the far wall. The door was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness beyond. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. Emily's mind was racing. How could they have missed this door during all the times they had gone through the attic? The house was old, yes, but they had been through every inch of it, or so they had thought. Mark approached the door, pushing it open with the end of his flashlight. It creaked ominously, revealing a narrow, dust-covered room that smelled of mildew and something far worse, something rotten. The air was so cold, it sent shivers down Emily's spine. Inside the hidden room, they found old furniture covered with sheets, tattered books, and strange markings on the walls. But the thing that caught Emily's eye was a set of dusty footprints leading from the door to the far corner of the room. Footprints that seemed to stop abruptly, as if whoever made them had simply vanished. "What is this place?" Mark muttered, shining his flashlight around. "I don't remember this on the house plans." Before Emily could respond, the temperature in the room plummeted even further. Their breath fogged in front of them, and a whispering sound filled the air, like the rustle of leaves or voices. Emily turned to Mark, her eyes wide with terror. "Let's get out of here," she said urgently. But just as they turned to leave, the door to the hidden room slammed shut with a deafening bang. The flashlight flickered and went out, plunging them into total darkness. For a moment, all they could hear was the rain hammering against the roof. Then, from somewhere in the darkness came the sound of slow, dragging footsteps, footsteps that were getting closer. Emily's scream was drowned out by a clap of thunder as something cold and unseen brushed against her arm. End of Chapter 2. The sound of rain intensifies, then gradually softens to a gentle, calming rhythm as the story fades, allowing the listener to relax and drift into sleep. The rain drummed steadily against the roof of the old house, a rhythmic lullaby that echoed through its dusty halls. Tonight the storm was especially fierce, with flashes of lightning illuminating the darkened rooms in brief, strobe-like bursts. Emily stood by the window, watching the rain cascade down in sheets, obscuring the world beyond. It had been 2 months since she, her husband Mark, and their 2 children moved into this old colonial house, tucked away at the edge of town. From the outside, the house was charming, a piece of history nestled among tall, swaying trees. But inside, it was far from perfect. Creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and a basement that seemed perpetually damp, no matter the weather. But the one thing Emily couldn't shake was the attic. From the moment they moved in, she felt something off about it. It started small, the occasional sound of something shifting or the soft creak of wood, which they attributed to the house settling. But every time it rained, the noises seemed to grow louder. At first, Mark brushed it off, reassuring Emily it was just the wind, or perhaps a squirrel that had made its way inside. But deep down, Emily knew it was something more. Tonight, the rainstorm was one of the heaviest they had experienced since moving in. Emily tried to shake off her unease as she tucked their 2 kids, Olivia and Max, into bed. She kissed their foreheads, her hands lingering for a moment longer than usual, as if to draw some comfort from their peaceful faces. As she closed their door, she heard it again, a faint creaking sound coming from above. She paused, holding her breath, her ears straining. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like the slow, measured footsteps of someone pacing back and forth. Her heart began to race, but she forced herself to breathe. It's just the wind, she told herself. Mark was already in bed, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the world around him. Emily stood in the doorway, debating whether to mention the noises again. She knew what he would say, that it was her imagination running wild, spurred on by the storm. "Do you hear that?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Hear what?" "Footsteps from the attic." He sighed and set his phone down. "Emily, we've been through this. It's just the old wood expanding and contracting with the humidity." But just as he said it, there was a distinct sound, a heavy thud directly above their bedroom. Mark's eyes widened. For the first time, he looked genuinely concerned. "All right," he muttered, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "I'll check it out." Emily grabbed his arm. "Be careful." With a quick nod, Mark grabbed a flashlight from the closet and headed toward the attic stairs. Emily stood at the base of the steps, her heart hammering in her chest as she watched him disappear into the darkness. The sound of his footsteps echoed above her, the old wooden stairs creaking under his weight. She listened intently, the flashlight beam flickering in the gaps between the floorboards above. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the sound of rain pounding against the roof. The rain was coming down in torrents, each drop like a pinprick against the dense canopy of the forest. The trees swayed ominously, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky as if they wanted to tear open the clouds. Sam and Tyler trudged along the muddy trail, their backpacks heavy with water and their boots squelching with every step. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, a camping trip to unwind from their stressful jobs. But now, lost in the woods with darkness closing in, it felt like a terrible idea. "This doesn't look like the map," Tyler grumbled, wiping rain from his eyes and trying to shield the crumpled, soggy paper with his hands. Sam squinted through the downpour. "I swear we were on the right path. Maybe the storm threw us off." The wind howled in response as if mocking them. They had been wandering for hours, the once familiar trail now swallowed by shadows and mist. The storm had turned the forest into a maze, with landmarks they thought they recognized vanishing into the dark like ghosts. "Look, we need to find shelter," Sam said, shivering. "It's getting too dark to see, and we're already soaked to the bone." Tyler nodded reluctantly. Just as they were about to turn back, Sam's flashlight caught a glimmer through the trees. A few yards away, barely visible through the rain, was the outline of a small cabin. "Do you see that?" Sam whispered. Tyler's eyes widened. "That wasn't there before, was it?" Sam shook his head, uncertain. But they didn't have much choice. The cold was seeping into their bones, and they couldn't keep wandering aimlessly through the storm. They made their way toward the cabin, pushing through the underbrush, their hearts racing with a mixture of hope and unease. Inside the cabin looked old, its wooden exterior weathered and covered in moss. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed against it. Sam hesitated, his instincts telling him to turn back, but Tyler pushed past him. "Let's just get out of this rain," Tyler said, stepping inside. Sam followed, his flashlight beam revealing a single, dimly lit room. It was sparsely furnished with a dusty table, 2 rickety chairs, and a fireplace that had clearly not been used in years. Oddly enough, there was no sign of decay or rot, despite the cabin's apparent age. It was as if it had been frozen in time. Tyler set his backpack down with a sigh of relief. Finally some shelter. He turned to Sam. "I'll try to get a fire going." Sam nodded, still uneasy. The air inside the cabin was musty, with a faint, unpleasant odor that he couldn't quite place. He shone his flashlight around the room, noticing strange carvings etched into the wooden walls. Spirals, symbols, and shapes that seemed to twist and shift in the flickering light. They looked ancient, almost ritualistic. "Hey, Tyler," Sam called. "Do you see these markings? They're weird." Tyler glanced up from the fireplace, where he was attempting to ignite some old dry logs. Probably just some old woodsman's scribbles. "We'll be out of here by morning." But something about the symbols made Sam's skin crawl. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The storm outside seemed to intensify, the wind howling like a chorus of distant screams. As the rain pounded against the cabin walls, he thought he heard whispers, faint, indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. He turned to Tyler. "Did you hear that?" Tyler frowned. "Hear what?" Before Sam could answer, a loud thud echoed from the back of the cabin, as if something heavy had fallen or been thrown. The sound sent a jolt of fear through both men. "What the hell was that?" Tyler whispered, his face pale. Sam tightened his grip on the flashlight, pointing it toward the far end of the room. "There's got to be a back room or something. Stay close." The 2 men moved cautiously toward the sound, their footsteps creaking on the old wooden floor. At the back of the cabin, they found a door partially hidden behind a dusty curtain. Sam pushed it open, revealing a narrow hallway that shouldn't have been there. The cabin was small. From the outside, it didn't look like it could contain more than 1 room. Yet, here they were, staring into a passageway that seemed to stretch impossibly far. "This doesn't make sense," Tyler muttered. The hallway was lit by a faint, eerie glow. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped sharply, their breath visible in the cold, damp air. The walls were covered in the same strange carvings, the symbols glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "Let's turn back," Sam said, his voice quivering. But when they turned around, the door to the main room was gone. The hallway stretched behind them now, endless in both directions. Panic set in. "This isn't possible," Tyler yelled, banging on the walls. "We came through here." The whispers grew louder, now more distinct, like dozens of voices whispering in a language neither of them could understand. Sam's flashlight began to flicker, casting frantic shadows that danced along the walls. The carvings seemed to shift and move, the symbols twisting into grotesque faces that leered at them. "Run!" Sam screamed, grabbing Tyler's arm. They sprinted down the hallway, the whispers turning into shrieks. The air grew thicker, like they were wading through water. The floor beneath them felt as if it were swaying, and the walls seemed to close in, as though the cabin itself was alive, trying to trap them. Just as they thought they were about to be swallowed by the darkness, they burst through a doorway and found themselves back in the main room. The storm outside had stopped, the air suddenly calm and still. They stumbled out of the cabin, gasping for breath, only to find themselves standing in an empty clearing. The cabin was gone. They looked around frantically. The trees were the same, the muddy trail they had followed still visible. But where the cabin had stood, there was nothing but wet grass and fallen leaves. It was as if the building had never existed. Did that just happen?" Tyler asked, his voice trembling. Sam didn't answer. He couldn't. The rain began to fall again, softly this time, as if the storm had been nothing more than a dream, but they both knew better. As they stumbled back to the trail, desperate to put distance between them and that cursed place, neither of them noticed the faint footprints that appeared in the mud behind them, prints that led straight from where the cabin had vanished. The small seaside village of Harper's Point was shrouded in mist, with the storm turning the once picturesque harbor into a turbulent cauldron of crashing waves. The sky was a dull gray, darkening by the minute, as though night was falling early. The rain poured relentlessly, soaking the narrow cobblestone streets and battering the windows of the old fishermen's cottages. The town was eerily quiet, most of the villagers having already taken shelter from the worsening storm. Nathan, a local fisherman, stood by the docks, his yellow raincoat plastered to his body by the wind. He had lived in Harper's Point all his life, and no storm had ever kept him from his evening routine. But tonight felt different. There was an electric tension in the air, a heavy stillness that pressed down on everything. It was the kind of weather that stirred up old legends, the kind that whispered of the sea's long-buried secrets. Nathan tugged his hood tighter around his face and glanced toward the water. The waves crashed violently against the rocks, sending up plumes of salty spray. His boat, the Sea Whisper, bobbed in the harbor like a toy, straining against its moorings. He was about to turn back toward the warmth of his home when he heard it, a faint voice calling his name. Nathan! He froze. The voice was barely audible over the howl of the wind, but it was unmistakable. It sounded like someone crying out from the sea. Nathan squinted through the sheets of rain, his heart pounding. At first, he saw nothing but the churning waves and the ghostly fog that clung to the water's surface. But then, just beyond the rocks, he caught a glimpse of something, a shadowy figure, half hidden by the mist. "Help me, Nathan!" The voice called again, more urgent this time. Without thinking, Nathan untied his boat, adrenaline overriding any sense of caution. It wasn't unusual for fishermen to get stranded in storms like this, and he couldn't leave someone to drown. As the boat rocked beneath him, he gunned the engine and steered toward the source of the cries. The rain was relentless, a curtain of water that seemed to blur the line between the sea and sky. Every time a flash of lightning lit up the horizon, he searched for that figure, but it always seemed to vanish before he could focus on it. The voice, however, never stopped calling his name, sometimes seeming to come from his left, then suddenly from his right, as if the storm itself were playing tricks on him. "Nathan, come closer." The voice was softer now, almost melodic, like a song carried on the wind. As he pushed farther out into the open water, Nathan began to realize something strange. The voice calling his name, it was familiar. It reminded him of someone he used to know. His mind raced as memories of his childhood surfaced. A friend who had drowned in these very waters nearly 30 years ago. "Tommy?" Nathan whispered, disbelief and terror battling in his mind. He shook his head. It couldn't be. Tommy had been lost at sea all those years ago. His body never recovered. And yet the voice had the same tone, the same lilt. But now it was tinged with something darker, something that sent chills down Nathan's spine. "Come to me, Nathan." As he pushed farther out into the storm, the sea grew rougher, the waves slamming against the side of the boat with enough force to nearly capsize it. But Nathan pressed on, driven by some primal instinct to follow the voice. Then, through the swirling mist, he saw it. A ship. But it wasn't just any ship. Its massive, rotting hull loomed out of the fog, barnacles and seaweed clinging to its sides. The sails were tattered, flapping uselessly in the howling wind. It was a ghostly vessel, one that looked like it had been lost to the sea centuries ago. Nathan's heart nearly stopped. He had heard stories of the Lady of the Deep, a ship that had vanished without a trace during a storm much like this one, leaving only whispers of its doomed crew. The voice was louder now, almost deafening. "Join us, Nathan." Nathan's boat drifted closer to the ghost ship, as if pulled by an invisible current. He could see figures on the deck now, shadowy shapes that moved like they were trapped in a slow, eternal dance. Lightning flashed again, and he caught a glimpse of their faces, hollow eyes, skin stretched tight over skeletal frames, their mouths open in silent screams. They were the crew of the Lady of the Deep, forever lost at sea, damned to roam the waters for eternity. Nathan's terror reached its peak, but his body refused to obey. The haunting voices seemed to pull him in, whispering secrets that no living man was meant to hear. His hands, almost moving on their own, reached for the rope ladder dangling from the ship's side. He had to know, had to see if Tommy was really there. But as his fingers brushed the slick, decayed wood of the ladder, the whispering stopped. The storm seemed to pause, the air heavy with an unnatural silence. Then, with a force that nearly knocked him off his feet, the sea beneath him roared to life. A wave as tall as a building surged up, slamming into Nathan's boat and sending it spinning. He lost his grip on the ladder and tumbled into the icy water. For a moment, everything was chaos. The cold enveloped him, the salt stinging his eyes. He struggled to the surface, gasping for breath, only to find the ghost ship gone. There was no sign of it, just the endless, dark expanse of the sea and the distant glow of the village lights. The storm had calmed to a drizzle, the thunder now a distant rumble. Nathan frantically scanned the horizon, but the Lady of the Deep had vanished, as if it had never been there. Exhausted, he managed to haul himself back into his boat, shivering uncontrollably. He steered back to shore, his mind reeling. Had it all been a hallucination, a trick of the storm? But as he tied up his boat and stumbled onto the dock, something cold and heavy in his pocket caught his attention. Pulling it out, he stared in horror. It was an old, rusted compass, one that he recognized instantly. It had belonged to Tommy, the very same compass they had played with as children. How it ended up in his pocket was a question he would never be able to answer. From that night on, Nathan was never the same. He stopped going out to sea, the fear of what he had seen or thought he had seen haunting him. Every time it stormed, he could swear he heard the whispers again, calling his name from the depths. And in the darkest hours of the night, when the rain beat against his windows, he would wake in a cold sweat, convinced he could hear Tommy's voice, begging him to join him on the ghostly ship that roamed the endless, unforgiving sea. The rain lashed against the windows of the old Ravenwood Hotel, a Victorian-era building that stood like a forgotten sentinel on the outskirts of town. The storm had come out of nowhere, the skies darkening with a sudden fury that sent tourists and locals alike scrambling for cover. Inside the grand lobby, the chandelier flickered as a bolt of lightning illuminated the old stained-glass windows, casting eerie shadows across the tiled floor. Claire was exhausted. After a long day of traveling and a canceled flight, she had finally managed to find a room at the only hotel that still had vacancies. She didn't care that it was old and musty, or that the front desk clerk had given her a strange look when he handed her the key to room 713. "Are you sure you want that one, miss?" the clerk had asked, hesitating. "We do have other rooms." But Claire was in no mood to be picky. She just wanted a hot shower and a good night's sleep. She waved off his concern and made her way up the grand staircase, which creaked ominously with every step. The air seemed to grow colder as she reached the 7th floor, the lights dimming as if struggling against the storm outside. When she reached room 713, the brass numbers glinted dully in the faint light. The door was old and scuffed, and the key stuck in the lock for a moment before finally turning with a reluctant click. Claire pushed it open, stepping into the darkness beyond. Inside room 713, the room was larger than she expected, furnished with antique pieces that looked like they had been there since the hotel was first built. Heavy velvet drapes covered the windows, and the air carried a faint scent of dampness and decay. The rain outside seemed to intensify as she closed the door behind her, shutting out the world. Claire flicked on the lights, which buzzed softly before casting a dim, yellowish glow. She set her suitcase down and tried to relax. The room was chilly, so she turned the thermostat up, hoping to chase away the damp cold that seemed to cling to her bones. After a long, hot shower, she felt somewhat rejuvenated. She wrapped herself in a towel and moved to the window, pulling back the heavy drapes. The view was disappointing, just an alleyway below, filled with puddles that reflected the stormy sky. She sighed and let the drapes fall back into place, then slipped into bed, hoping to get some rest before her early flight in the morning. But as soon as she turned off the lights, the room seemed to take on a life of its own. The rain drummed against the windows with a fury that matched her racing heartbeat. Claire pulled the covers up to her chin, willing herself to sleep. But that's when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping on the window. Her eyes snapped open, and her pulse quickened. She tried to tell herself it was just a branch, or maybe something caught in the wind. But the tapping was too deliberate, too steady. She turned on the bedside lamp, the dim light barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. The tapping stopped immediately, leaving only the sound of the rain. Taking a deep breath, she got out of bed and slowly approached the window. The room was on the 7th floor, so it was impossible for anyone to be outside. As she drew back the curtain, her breath caught in her throat. The window was fogged up from the inside, and there, written in the condensation, were the words, "Let me in." Claire's scream caught in her throat, her mind racing. She wiped the message away with her sleeve, convinced she was imagining things. Maybe the steam from her shower had caused the fog, and she was just overtired. But as she backed away, she heard the tapping again. Louder this time, more insistent. Tap, tap. Grabbing her phone, she dialed the front desk. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a voice finally answered. "Front desk, how may I assist you?" I think someone's trying to get into my room," she stammered. "I'm in room 713. Can you send someone up, please?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, the clerk's voice, now tinged with something that sounded like pity, came back. "Miss, there's no one else on your floor. In fact, room 713 hasn't been occupied in years." "What are you talking about? I'm in the room right now." Claire snapped, her panic rising. "Miss, room 713 was sealed off after a guest had an incident," the clerk said hesitantly. "We don't rent that room anymore." The line went dead, replaced by a soft, static hum. Claire's hands were shaking now, her mind reeling. She backed away from the phone, her eyes darting around the room. It felt colder than ever, like the air itself was leaching the warmth from her skin. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into total darkness. The tapping at the window grew louder, almost frantic now, accompanied by a low whispering that seemed to seep from the walls. "Let me in." The sound was coming from all around her, like a chorus of voices overlapping, rising and falling in a sickening chant. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled toward the door, her fingers fumbling for the handle. But no matter how hard she twisted, the door wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been locked from the outside. Panic gripped her. She turned back toward the window, and her blood ran cold. There, standing on the other side of the glass, was a figure, a pale face with hollow eyes staring directly at her. The lips moved soundlessly, mouthing the same words over and over. "Let me in." Suddenly, the window shattered inward, the cold air rushing in like a tidal wave. Claire screamed, shielding her face from the shards of glass. The figure was gone, but the whispers remained, now louder than ever, filling the room with their relentless demands. In a last desperate attempt, she ran to the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind her. The whispers were muffled but still present, like something trying to claw its way through the walls. She backed into the corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind on the edge of breaking. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the cold air dissipated, and the rain outside softened to a gentle drizzle. Cautiously, Claire opened the bathroom door, expecting to find the room in shambles. But it was exactly as she had left it. The window was intact, the bed neatly made, and her suitcase sitting by the door. Confused, she hurriedly gathered her things and fled the room, not daring to look back. As she reached the lobby, the The clerk gave her a knowing, sorrowful look but said nothing. She didn't bother to check out. She just wanted to get as far away from the hotel as possible. The next morning, as the sun finally broke through the clouds, Claire returned to the hotel, determined to demand an explanation. But when she arrived, the building was boarded up, abandoned, as if it had been vacant for years. There was no sign of life, no sign that anyone had stayed there the night before. Room 713 was gone, just like the whispers that haunted her dreams for years to come. The old house stood at the end of a long, gravel driveway, surrounded by a forest that seemed to swallow it whole. Rain poured steadily from the darkening sky, creating a mist that wrapped around the gnarled trees like ghostly fingers. Anna and her husband David had recently purchased the property, eager for a fresh start in the countryside after the chaos of city life. The house was a fixer-upper, to be sure, but it had charm. At least that's what they told themselves as they unpacked in the cold, damp air. The previous owners had left behind a jumble of old furniture and boxes in the attic. The realtor had brushed it off, claiming they had been too old to move everything. But to Anna, the clutter was part of the house's mysterious allure. It was like stepping into another time, exploring the dusty remnants of someone else's life. A week after moving in, on a rainy Saturday afternoon, Anna decided to tackle the attic. She climbed the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. The attic was dimly lit by a single bulb, its weak light barely cutting through the shadows. As she sorted through the piles of forgotten items, she came across an old, wooden chest tucked into a corner. It was covered in dust, the hinges rusted with age. Curious Anna forced it open with a bit of effort. Inside, wrapped in layers of yellowed linen, was a doll. It was unlike any she had ever seen, about a foot tall, with porcelain skin so pale it was almost ghostly. Its eyes were a piercing blue, staring straight ahead with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. The doll wore a delicate, old-fashioned lace dress, now discolored with age, and its black hair was pulled back into tight ringlets. "Creepy little thing," Anna muttered to herself. She was about to put it back when she noticed something carved into the base of the doll's foot. Margaret, 1912. "What's that?" David's voice made her jump. He had come up to check on her. "Just a doll," she said, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. "I think it's from the early 1900s. Kind of eerie, isn't it?" David shrugged. "Weird, but it might be worth something. Maybe an antique collector would want it." For reasons she couldn't explain, Anna decided to keep the doll. She placed it on a shelf in the guest room, thinking it would add a touch of vintage charm. But that night, as the storm intensified, bringing with it howling winds and torrential rain, strange things began to happen. The first night, unexplained noises. Anna woke to the sound of soft giggling in the middle of the night. It was faint, barely audible over the storm outside, but unmistakable. She sat up, straining her ears. The laughter was coming from the direction of the guest room. "David, wake up," she whispered, shaking him. David groaned and rolled over. "It's just the wind, Anna. Go back to sleep." But Anna couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. She tiptoed down the hall, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached the guest room, the giggling stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of the rain pelting against the windows. She opened the door slowly, half expecting to find someone inside. But the room was empty, the doll sitting exactly where she had left it, its unblinking eyes staring directly at the door as if it had been waiting for her. Shaking her head, she scolded herself for being silly and went back to bed. But as she drifted off, she could have sworn she heard a faint whisper, "Play with me." The second night, the moving doll. The next morning, Anna convinced herself that the noises were just her imagination. But when she walked into the guest room to dust, she froze. The doll had moved. It was no longer on the shelf, but was instead sitting on the bed, its legs dangling over the side. "David, did you move the doll?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. David came in frowning. "No, why would I? You're just imagining things. Maybe it fell over." But Anna knew better. There was no way the doll could have simply moved on its own. especially not to a sitting position. Still, she tried to push the thought from her mind. She placed the doll back on the shelf, making sure it was securely propped up, and left the room. That night, the rain returned, hammering against the roof with renewed fury. Around midnight, they were both jolted awake by a loud thud coming from the guest room. Anna's heart was racing. This time, David heard it too. "I'll check it out," he said, grabbing a flashlight. Anna followed him down the hall, gripping his arm tightly. The guest room door was ajar, and as they stepped inside, the beam of the flashlight revealed the doll lying face down in the middle of the floor. It was as if someone had thrown it there in a fit of rage. "Okay, that's it," David said, picking up the doll. "I'm getting rid of this thing." He stormed down the stairs and tossed it into a box in the garage. The third night, scratching and whispers. They thought that would be the end of it, but that night the sound started again, soft scratching like tiny fingers dragging against the walls. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Let me in, let me play." Anna and David tried to ignore it, but the sounds only intensified, now seeming to come from inside their bedroom walls. Desperate, they got out of bed, grabbing flashlights. As they entered the hallway, they were met with the sight of wet, muddy footprints leading from the garage all the way to the guest room. "Impossible," David muttered, his voice shaking. "We locked the garage door." With dread tightening in their chests, they opened the guest room door. There, sitting on the bed, was the doll. Its eyes seemed to gleam with malevolence in the dim light. The lace of its dress was soaked, dripping water onto the bedspread as if it had been outside in the rain. "I threw you out!" David shouted, grabbing the doll and flinging it against the wall. But as soon as it hit the ground, the whispers erupted into a cacophony, filling the house with ear-splitting cries. "You can't get rid of me! I'm part of this house now!" The lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The rain outside turned into a deafening roar, as if the storm itself was feeding off the chaos inside the house. The doll, lying on the floor, began to twitch, its limbs moving as if it were trying to stand up. "Run!" Anna screamed, grabbing David's hand. They bolted down the stairs, the whispers following them, growing louder and more desperate. They stumbled out into the rain, not stopping until they reached the safety of their car. As they drove away, the lights in the old house flickered back on, and through the rearview mirror, Anna could see the doll standing at the window, watching them leave. Epilogue: The Return of the Doll. The next day, they returned with a priest to cleanse the house. But when they entered the guest room, the doll was gone. The priest performed a blessing, assuring them that whatever presence had been there was now banished. Relieved, Anna and David tried to move on with their lives. But a week later, as they were unpacking a new delivery of groceries, Anna opened a box to find the doll sitting inside, its porcelain face cracked into a twisted grin. A note was tucked into its hand, written in the same childish scrawl. "You can't escape me. We'll play forever." The rain poured down in relentless sheets, drumming against the rooftops and turning the quiet suburban neighborhood into a sea of reflections. Streetlights cast a dim glow over the puddles, flickering occasionally as if struggling to stay alive. Sarah stood by her kitchen window, staring out at the storm-soaked street. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic sound of rain hitting the glass. It had been a long day, and she was grateful her 8-year-old son Ethan was finally asleep upstairs. Her husband Tom was out of town on a business trip, leaving her alone in their cozy but suddenly too empty house. As she sipped her tea, trying to unwind, something caught her eye. Across the street, barely visible through the downpour, stood a figure. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by the swaying branches of the large oak tree. But no, it was definitely a person. The figure was tall, dressed in what looked like a dark hooded coat, standing completely still, watching her house. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Who would be out there at this hour, in this weather? She leaned closer to the window, trying to get a better look, but the figure remained motionless, almost blending into the shadows. Feeling a chill crawl up her spine, she quickly pulled the curtains shut. "It's just your imagination," she told herself, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Probably just a neighbor taking a walk. But as she turned to head upstairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The first encounter, strange footprints. The next morning, the storm had eased to a drizzle, but the sky remained overcast, as if the sun had forgotten how to shine. Sarah went outside to grab the newspaper and froze. There, on the rain-soaked driveway, were muddy footprints. They led from the street, right up to her front door, and then back again, as if someone had stood there, staring inside for who knows how long. A shiver of fear ran down her spine. She glanced around the quiet neighborhood, but there was no sign of anyone. The street was deserted, the houses dark and silent. Trying to brush off her anxiety, Sarah went back inside and locked the door behind her, double-checking the deadbolt. She told herself it must have been some prankster. But deep down, she couldn't shake the memory of the shadowy figure she had seen the night before. That night, as the rain returned with renewed intensity, the unease in Sarah's chest grew heavier. The second night, a knock at the window. As the storm raged outside, Sarah lay in bed, trying to sleep. The house creaked softly, the wind rattling in the windows. Just as she was about to drift off, a sound jolted her awake, a soft but distinct tap. Tap, tap on the window by her bed. Her eyes flew open, her heart racing. She turned to look, but all she could see was the darkness beyond the rain-streaked glass. For a moment, she thought it might be a branch tapping against the window. But then the tapping came again, slow and deliberate, like someone was trying to get her attention. Swallowing her fear, she forced herself to get up and approach the window. She drew the curtains back slowly, her breath fogging up the glass as she leaned in to peer outside. There was nothing there, but just as she was about to close the curtains, lightning flashed, illuminating the street outside. For a split second, she saw it, the same shadowy figure standing across the street, staring directly at her. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath the hood, but she could feel its gaze boring into her. Sarah's blood ran cold. She stumbled back, pulling the curtains shut with trembling hands. She wanted to call the police, but what would she say? That someone was standing on the street, watching her house? They would think she was paranoid. The third night, the figure in the house. By the third night, Sarah was on edge. She made sure every door and window was locked, every curtain drawn. She tucked Ethan into bed, trying to hide her anxiety with a forced smile. "It's just another storm, sweetheart. You're safe," she reassured him. But as she settled into bed, the rain came down harder, and the house seemed to groan under the weight of the storm. Just as she was beginning to relax, she heard it again. The soft tapping. But this time it wasn't coming from the bedroom window. It was coming from downstairs. Her heart pounded in her ears. She grabbed the baseball bat Tom kept under the bed and crept down the stairs, each step creaking beneath her weight. As she reached the bottom, she noticed the faintest glow coming from the living room. The curtains were slightly ajar, swaying as if someone had just passed through them. She approached cautiously, holding her breath. But as she stepped into the living room, her blood ran cold. The front door was wide open, rain pouring in and pooling on the floor. The footprints were back, but this time they were fresh, leading from the open door toward the staircase. "Ethan!" she screamed, dropping the bat and racing upstairs. She burst into his room, only to find him still asleep, blissfully unaware. But as she turned to leave, she saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway, watching her with those same cold, unreadable eyes. The figure was closer now, inside her home. Gathering her courage, she charged down the hallway, ready to swing the bat, but the figure vanished, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been there. Panting, she flipped on every light in the house, but there was no sign of an intruder. The final encounter, the unseen visitor. Unable to sleep, Sarah sat on the couch, clutching a mug of coffee with trembling hands. She kept all the lights on, waiting for the dawn. As the hours dragged on, the rain outside began to lighten, turning into a soft drizzle. But just when she thought it was over, she heard a voice. Faint, almost a whisper. "Sarah, let me in." Her heart stopped. It was coming from the front door. Slowly she approached, her pulse racing. She looked through the peephole but saw nothing but darkness. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Let me in." She backed away, terror gripping her. Just as she turned to run, there was a sudden crash, the sound of glass shattering. She spun around to see the living room window had been broken, rain and wind pouring in. And then she saw it, the shadowy figure standing inside, inches away. This time she could see its face, or rather the lack of one. It was like staring into a void, a darkness so complete it seemed to suck the light out of the room. The figure reached out with a skeletal hand, its voice now a low, guttural whisper. "You invited me in." Sarah screamed, backing away until she was pressed against the wall. But just as the figure was about to reach her, the first rays of dawn broke through the storm clouds. The figure let out a hiss, retreating into the shadows and disappearing as the light flooded the room. Epilogue: The rain returns. The police arrived later that morning, responding to Sarah's frantic call. They found the broken window, the muddy footprints, and a woman on the edge of a nervous breakdown. But there was no evidence of an intruder. The neighbors claimed they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. Sarah and Ethan left the house that day, moving in with her sister in another town, but the fear never really left her. And every time it rained, Sarah would find herself peering out the window, searching the shadows for that figure. Because deep down, she knew. It was still out there, waiting for the next stormy night, waiting for her to let her guard down. And she could still hear its whisper, echoing in the back of her mind. "Let me in, let me in." Welcome to grim fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily, just for you. Bellamy Manor wasn't just a house. It was a monument to time, a building that seemed to watch the town grow and change around it while remaining utterly still. Everyone in the village had a story about it. Some swore they'd seen lights in its windows when it should have been empty. Others claimed to hear faint music, like the notes of an old music box carried on the night wind. But no one ever stayed long enough to confirm these tales. Nobody except Sarah. Sarah Walker was the kind of person who found beauty in the unlovely. She wasn't naive. She just had a relentless curiosity that sometimes overpowered her better judgment. When she arrived in the village for a semester break, she was drawn to the manor like a moth to a flame. It wasn't just the challenge that excited her, though she did enjoy a good dare. It was the mystery. What happened to the Bellamys all those years ago? Why had the townsfolk let the house rot in silence? When Sarah asked about it, the locals clammed up. An older man at the general store simply frowned. "You don't want to go messing around up there," he said, shoving her change across the counter. "Bad things happen to people who go in that house." "Like what?" Sarah asked. She couldn't help herself. He just shook his head. "Just don't." But it was too late. Once she heard the warnings, once she saw the way people refused to even glance toward the hill where the manor stood, Sarah was hooked. That evening, she grabbed her flashlight, a water bottle, and a notebook. If nothing else, she figured she could jot down a few thoughts, take some pictures, and satisfy her curiosity. How many times had she been told to stay away from something, only to find it was harmless? The old Bellamy Manor was just a house, she told herself. It couldn't really do her any harm. Could it? The walk up the hill was steeper than she expected. As the village lights faded behind her, she began to feel more alone. The air grew cooler, and the shadows stretched longer as dusk deepened into night. By the time she reached the house, her breath was coming in quick, shallow gasps, not just from the climb, but from the sight of the manor itself. It loomed against the darkening sky, its roof jagged like broken teeth. The windows were black voids, their frames warped and rotting. The front door was massive, painted a deep green that had faded and chipped away over the years. The house didn't look empty. It looked like it was waiting. Sarah took a steadying breath and pressed her hand against the iron gate. The cold metal bit into her palm. She gave it a push, and the gate swung open on rusted hinges with a screech that echoed into the trees. She stepped onto the path that led to the front door. The gravel crunched beneath her boots, each step sounding far too loud in the stillness. Something moved in the periphery of her vision, a flutter like a bird's wing, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Just the house, the path, and the suffocating silence. At the door, Sarah hesitated. Her hand hovered over the brass doorknob, tarnished but still intact. She glanced behind her, half expecting to see someone following her, though she knew no one else had dared to come this far. The village lay far below, its lights now mere pinpricks in the distance. The air felt heavy, as though the manor itself were leaning down to stare at her. She turned the knob and pushed. The door groaned open, revealing a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. Her flashlight beam flickered, the light weak against the darkness that spilled out from inside. It was colder here, colder than the night air outside. She took her first step into the old Bellamy Manor, and the door slammed shut behind her. The sound of the door slamming behind her reverberated through the narrow entryway, startling Sarah into a sharp inhale. She spun around, her flashlight darting across the heavy oak panels. But the door was just as it had been closed, unmoving. The oppressive silence settled again, wrapping around her like a thick, unseen cloak. She reminded herself that she had shut the door against the chill. She must have, but as she reached for it, the knob wouldn't turn. Locked, she frowned. Perhaps the mechanism was old and jammed, she thought. She shook it once, twice, but it remained firm in her grasp. She turned back toward the hallway, raising her flashlight higher. The light barely cut through the shadows. The darkness seemed to eat it. The beam revealed cracked walls, lined with faded, peeling wallpaper. Dust motes hung in the air, swirling as she moved. A heavy silence pressed down on her, the kind that made her own footsteps sound deafeningly loud. Each creak of the wooden floorboards under her boots felt like a crack splitting through the stillness. As she ventured deeper into the hall, she became aware of how cold it was. Her breath puffed out invisible clouds. There was no wind, no draft she could feel, and yet the temperature was sinking fast, biting through her jacket. She paused to rub her arms, glancing around. The house, though decrepit, felt oddly aware, as if it were listening to her every movement. Then she heard it, a whisper, faint and indistinct. She held her breath, straining her ears. It came again, just on the edge of hearing. It wasn't clear enough to make out words, but it was unmistakably a voice. She whipped her flashlight toward the source of the sound, her heart pounding. The hallway was empty, the beam only revealing more cracked wallpaper and a framed photo hanging crookedly on the wall. She stepped closer, the whisper falling silent, as if aware of her approach. The photograph was black and white, its glass cracked and cloudy. It showed a family of 4 standing on the front steps of Bellamy Manor, their faces eerily faded. A man, a woman, a young boy, and a girl not much older than Sarah when the photo was taken. The girl's expression struck her, a slight smile that seemed to linger just a moment too long. Sarah tilted the frame, trying to get a better look. The light reflected oddly, making it seem like the girl's eyes glinted for a second. Her stomach turned, and she quickly stepped back. She continued forward, her flashlight beam flickering again. The house creaked and groaned as if shifting under her weight. The walls were lined with closed doors, their paint peeling in long, curling strips. She reached for one door, pausing before twisting the handle. Inside was a sitting room filled with covered furniture. Dusty white sheets draped chairs, a couch, and a small table. The only uncovered object was a porcelain doll sitting upright on the mantel. Its once rosy cheeks were now cracked and faded, its glassy eyes staring forward with an intensity that made her uneasy. Another whisper sounded, louder this time, and Sarah spun toward the hall. She swung her flashlight wildly. Nothing. Only the hollow groans of the house settling around her. The whisper returned, closer, as if someone were just behind her, breathing against her neck. She whirled again, her heart hammering. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. The air seemed heavier, the walls closer. She felt like she was being watched, like 1,000 unseen eyes were fixed on her every move. She forced herself to take a steadying breath and focused on the sound of her boots on the floorboards, pushing away the whispers that now seemed to echo from every corner. But something was wrong. The hallway ahead looked different. The door she'd entered through was no longer visible, as if the house had shifted itself. She swore she had only taken a few steps past the sitting room, but now the hall stretched impossibly long, the light from her flashlight unable to reach the end. Sarah turned to look behind her, expecting to see the sitting room doorway, but the hall was empty in that direction as well. It was as if the house had swallowed the rooms she had passed through. Her chest tightened, her breathing quickened. She gripped her flashlight tighter and took a few steps forward. The whisper came again, clearer now, just ahead. It didn't sound like a single voice anymore. It sounded like many voices layered together, calling her name in a low, rhythmic chant. Sarah, Sarah. The sound made her skin crawl. She wanted to turn around, to run, but her feet moved forward against her better judgment. The whispers grew louder with every step. As she moved deeper into the house, the air seemed to hum with a low vibration, and she had the unsettling feeling that she was not walking through the house at all. She was descending into something else entirely. The whispers seemed to vanish the moment Sarah stepped into the next room. For a moment she thought the house had quieted, that maybe she'd imagined the sounds. But then she saw the room's only prominent feature, a massive mirror dominating the far wall. It was out of place among the otherwise stark surroundings. The floorboards were warped, the ceiling sagging, but the mirror gleamed faintly in the light of her flashlight. Its frame was elaborate, almost gaudy, with curling vines and roses carved into the tarnished silver. The glass itself wasn't smooth. It was rippled and streaked, making her reflection appear hazy and warped. Sarah hesitated in the doorway, the beam of her flashlight dancing over the surface of the mirror. Her own image wavered, barely recognizable in the uneven glass. Something about it made her stomach turn. She stepped closer, cautiously, her boots creaking on the floorboards. With each step, her reflection grew clearer, more defined. But there was something off. Her eyes. In the mirror, her eyes seemed slightly wider, her pupils darker than they should have been. She blinked and felt her eyes close. Her reflection, however, did not blink. It stared back at her, unflinching. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She reached up to rub her own face, and the reflection mimicked her, but a fraction of a second too late, as though it were trying to keep up rather than following her movements naturally. She lowered her hand and stepped back, her flashlight shaking as unease began to spread through her body. She turned away, her heart pounding. Maybe it was just the uneven glass. Maybe the mirror was warped enough to create strange illusions. But before she could leave, her reflection moved again. She hadn't turned around, hadn't glanced back at the mirror, but she caught the movement from the corner of her eye. Her reflection tilted its head to one side. Slowly, intentionally, Sarah froze in place, her skin prickling. She forced herself to look back. The reflection was smiling. Her own face stared back at her with a grin she had not made. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was too wide, too forced, and it didn't reach her reflection's eyes. The figure tilted its head again, this time the other way, as if it were studying her. Sarah stepped back again, her legs unsteady, and the reflection didn't follow. It stayed there, frozen in its unsettling smile, watching her. "Hello," Sarah's voice wavered. The words sounded too loud, echoing off the empty walls. The reflection's grin widened further. Her stomach churned, and she took another step back. Then she noticed something else in the mirror, something moving behind her reflection. A shadow shifted along the edge of the glass, just outside the reflection's frame. It wasn't her shadow. The light from her flashlight wasn't angled that way. The shadow moved on its own, creeping closer to her reflected image. It reached toward her reflection, its long, dark fingers curling around the edges of the glass. Sarah turned abruptly, her flashlight cutting through the dim room. Nothing was behind her. The floor was empty, the walls bare. Her chest heaved as she tried to slow her breathing. When she turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone, but her reflection was closer, pressing its hands against the glass as if it wanted to push through. The smile was gone, replaced with an expression of pure malice. Her reflection mouthed words she couldn't hear, but the meaning was clear. Don't leave. The room felt colder, the air seemed heavier. Sarah's legs finally unlocked and she stumbled backward, not daring to take her eyes off the mirror. Her reflection slammed its palms against the glass, and for a brief moment she thought she heard a faint crack. She spun on her heel and bolted out of the room, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she ran. Behind her, the mirror's surface rippled like water. Something moved within, something that wasn't her reflection. The whispers started again, rising into a low, mocking laughter. Sarah didn't stop until she was back in the hallway, gasping for air. When she finally turned to look, the door to the mirrored room was closed tight. She didn't dare open it again. The laughter faded, leaving only the eerie, suffocating silence of the house. Sarah leaned against the hallway wall, her breath shallow and quick. Her flashlight beam jittered across the warped wallpaper as her shaking hands struggled to keep it steady. She glanced back at the closed door to the mirror room, half expecting it to open again, to unleash whatever had been lurking behind her reflection. But it remained shut. For now. The silence returned, oppressive and almost smothering. She couldn't tell if her ears were ringing from her own panicked breathing, or if the house itself thrummed with a faint, low hum. She took a step forward, toward what she thought was the staircase she'd come up earlier. But the hall seemed different now. The walls were closer together, the air even colder, and the faint smell of mildew was mixed with something sharper, something like rusted iron. She tightened her grip on her flashlight and moved forward, one hesitant step at a time. It was then that she heard it. A faint scratching noise, so soft at first she thought she might be imagining it. But as she stood still, holding her breath, the sound grew louder. It was coming from ahead, down the hall, from one of the closed doors. The scratching was irregular, sometimes frantic, sometimes slow and deliberate. It wasn't a single source, either. It was as if multiple sets of nails were dragging themselves across wood. Sarah shivered, her pulse thudding in her ears. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavier. She didn't know if she wanted the noise to start again just so she could place it, or if she was desperate for it to vanish entirely. She stood frozen, staring down the hall. And then, just as she thought the house might let her leave without incident, the door at the end of the hallway creaked open. Her flashlight flickered as she pointed it toward the sound. The door wasn't fully open, just cracked enough to reveal the edge of a darkened room. She took a step back, every instinct screaming at her to turn and run. But her feet wouldn't move. Her curiosity, morbid and unrelenting, urged her forward. What was making that sound? What could possibly be scratching at the door? Her pulse thundered as she took one slow step, then another, toward the end of the hall. The door swung wider, revealing more darkness. The scratching resumed, louder now, more erratic. Sarah clenched her teeth. Every nerve in her body screamed that this was wrong, that she needed to turn back. But she reached out anyway, her fingers brushing the edge of the door. She gave it a gentle push, and it creaked inward. Her flashlight revealed a bedroom. The walls were lined with faded floral wallpaper, curling at the edges. The bed frame was wooden and splintered, the mattress long gone. A wardrobe stood against one wall, its door hanging open, but it was the floor that drew her attention. Deep, jagged grooves scored the wood in long, chaotic patterns. They were fresh. The edges of the scratches were sharp, as if made moments before. Sarah's mouth went dry. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The scratching stopped again. The stillness returned, pressing down on her chest. She scanned the room, moving her flashlight slowly. For a moment there was nothing, just the empty furniture, the gouged floor, and the damp chill. And then, in the far corner, she saw it. Something crouched there, its back to her, barely illuminated by the unsteady light. It was small, its frame hunched and unnatural. Its hands, or what should have been hands, were clawed, digging into the floorboards. The creature froze as her light passed over it. Slowly, impossibly slowly, it began to turn its head. Sarah couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The thing's face came into view, pale and grotesque, with hollow sockets where eyes should have been. A mouth stretched too wide, filled with teeth that looked more like splintered bone. It grinned. A low, guttural sound emerged from its throat, a rasping, rattling noise that made Sarah's knees weaken. She stumbled back, her flashlight dropping to her side. The creature started to move, crawling toward her with a jerking, uneven motion. Its claws scratched at the floor again, the sound piercing and horrible. Sarah turned and ran. She didn't look back. The sound of scratching followed her down the hallway, growing louder, more frantic. The house seemed to shift around her, the walls leaning in, the ceiling pressing down. She stumbled down the staircase, nearly falling, her flashlight bouncing wildly. The scratching was in her ears, in her skull. It was everywhere, and then suddenly it stopped. She found herself in the front hall again, standing at the base of the stairs. The door was still shut, the silence thick as ever. Her chest heaved as she gasped for air, her mind racing. For a moment, she wondered if she'd imagined it all, if the house was playing tricks on her. She took one step toward the front door, and her heart stopped. It was open. The heavy oak door she'd been certain was locked now stood ajar, a sliver of moonlight spilling inside. But as she moved closer, she realized the scratching hadn't stopped after all. It was just quieter now, softer. It was coming from the other side of the door. Something was waiting for her outside. Sarah froze at the threshold of the nursery. It was the first door she came across after the scratching had stopped, a narrow wooden thing that felt more oppressive than a simple door should. Her flashlight trembled in her grip as she slowly nudged it open. The hinges gave a quiet, plaintive creak, as if the room itself were sighing in resignation. The air inside was colder than the rest of the house, and it carried a faint, musty sweetness, like long-forgotten perfume. As the door swung wider, her flashlight beam illuminated the faded remnants of what had once been a child's room. The wallpaper, which must have been bright and cheerful decades ago, now hung in curling strips, its lambs and clouds cracked and ghostly. A tiny bed sat in the corner, its once bright coverlet now gray with age and dust. A dollhouse rested on a low table, its front panel hanging askew, revealing furniture and miniature figures toppled as if they'd been abandoned mid-game. In the far corner, a rocking horse stood still, its paint faded and its mane long gone. Its eyes, black beads that glinted faintly in the light, seemed to follow Sarah as she stepped inside. The floor creaked under her weight, and she stopped just a few steps in, feeling a prickling sensation run up the back of her neck. The air grew heavier with each breath, her skin crawling as though something unseen was studying her every move. She tried to focus on the ordinary, the cracked mobile hanging over the crib, the scattered blocks on the floor, the dust motes swirling in her flashlight's beam. It had all the markings of a place meant to nurture, to comfort, but everything felt wrong. The lambs on the wallpaper looked more like twisted figures the longer she stared, their painted eyes now sharp and predatory. The rocking horse seemed to lean slightly toward her. Then the sound came, a faint giggle, soft and sharp, like the tinkling of a broken wind-up music box. Sarah spun around, her flashlight darting wildly across the room. It seemed to come from the toy box in the corner, its lid slightly ajar. She hesitated, every nerve screaming at her to run, but she couldn't look away. The giggle came again, a little louder this time, sending an icy chill down her spine. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring of her heartbeat in her ears. The room gave no answer, no words, at least. But the rocking horse began to sway. It rocked slowly at first, then faster, its hooves tapping against the floor. The creaking grew louder, filling the small room, drowning out everything else. Sarah's hands trembled so badly that her flashlight beam shook like a strobe light, casting the rocking horse into disjointed, jerky motions. The giggle returned, louder now, and it was no longer alone. A second laugh joined it, then another. It sounded like children's laughter, but distorted, rising and falling like waves of static. The toy box lid creaked open wider. Sarah stepped back, bumping into the edge of the crib. The mobile above her began to spin on its own, the faded lambs and stars whirling faster and faster. "Stay with us," a voice whispered, high and childish. Sarah gasped, her breath catching in her throat. The blocks on the floor began to shift, sliding across the wood as if pulled by invisible strings. They aligned themselves into crude shapes, a word. "Stay." Her flashlight flickered, and for a moment the room plunged into darkness. When the beam returned, the room looked the same, but something had changed. The dollhouse figures, once scattered and face down, now stood upright, turned toward her. Their tiny painted faces stared at her, their frozen smiles wide and unnatural. The rocking horse stopped suddenly, the sound of its movement replaced by a suffocating silence. Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The whispers came again, surrounding her, overlapping and growing louder. Stay, stay, stay with us. She bolted. She turned and fled the nursery, slamming the door behind her. The voices faded, the giggles silenced. But as she leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, she realized the silence wasn't normal. It was heavy, waiting, as if the house itself was holding its breath. It wasn't over, not even close. Sarah pressed her back against the nursery door, her breath coming fast and shallow. The corridor in front of her was still dark, still oppressively silent, but it offered the tiniest glimmer of relief after what she'd just experienced. Her flashlight wavered in her unsteady grip, casting nervous beams across the warped walls and peeling wallpaper. She pushed herself off the door, trying to quiet her mind, and stepped cautiously forward. If she could just find her way back to the front door, if she could make it out of this suffocating labyrinth, everything would be okay. She repeated that in her head like a mantra. Her footsteps seemed to echo, though the house had a way of making sounds travel strangely. The door at the far end of the hallway caught her eye. It wasn't like the others. This one was slightly ajar, showing a sliver of a dimly lit room. The light seemed unnatural, faintly bluish, and it pulsed gently as though the air inside was alive. Sarah hesitated. Every rational thought told her not to go near that door, not after what she'd just experienced. But curiosity, combined with the strange magnetic pull of the light, tugged her forward. As she got closer, she saw the faint outline of lettering carved into the door's frame. The words were faded, scratched deeply into the wood, and mostly illegible. All Sarah could make out was a single word, mine. Her hand trembled as she reached for the door. She told herself she just wanted to look inside, to see what was casting that strange light. Nothing more, just one quick glance, and then she'd turn back. The moment she touched the door, it creaked open. The air in the room was icy, colder even than the nursery, and she saw her breath puff out in short clouds. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam barely making an impression against the dark corners of the room. The source of the light was a small lamp on a desk at the far end, flickering weakly. The desk itself was covered in papers, dozens of them, yellowed and curling at the edges. The walls were lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of rotting books. The smell of mildew and old paper hit her immediately, mixed with something metallic. She stepped closer to the desk, scanning the pages. They were covered in writing, but not the kind she could read. It looked like a child's scribbles, swirling, looping lines and jagged scratches. Some of the symbols repeated over and over, burned into the paper so deeply that they left holes. She reached out, her fingers brushing one of the pages. The paper felt unnaturally rough, almost sharp, as though the symbols themselves were raised. The moment she touched it, she felt a chill travel through her body. She snatched her hand back. She glanced around the room again, her flashlight catching on something just beside the desk. It was a large, heavy ledger bound in thick, cracked leather. A faint memory stirred in her mind. She had seen something like this in old photographs. Bellamy family records, maybe? She hesitated before pulling it closer. The cover was blank, but when she opened it, she saw names listed down the pages. Most were names she didn't recognize, followed by dates she didn't care to decipher. But as she flipped further, the names grew more familiar. People from the village, names she had heard whispered in passing. And then she froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her own name was there. Sarah Walker, written in the same jagged, almost childlike scrawl that covered the loose papers. Beside her name was today's date. Her fingers ran over the ink, her heart pounding in her chest. It was impossible. No one knew she was here. No one knew she'd come to Bellamy Manor. As she stared at the page, the flickering lamp dimmed further, and the room seemed to draw inward. The shelves looked closer than they had been moments ago. A shadow moved across the far wall, just at the edge of her vision. She swung her flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. She closed the ledger, her hands shaking. Behind her, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening, reverberating through the room like a gunshot. She spun around, the flashlight jerking in her hand. The door was closed tight, the handle unmoving when she tried it. Her chest heaved and her flashlight flickered again. She turned back toward the desk, hoping for some clue, some explanation, but the room had changed. The papers were gone, the books on the shelves now just faint outlines in the dark. The lamp was out entirely, and the only light came from her flashlight's fading beam. A sound broke the silence, a long, deep breath coming from the far corner of the room. She turned the light toward it, her hands trembling. There was nothing at first, just a mass of shadow. Then the shadows shifted, and a shape emerged, a figure crouching low, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Its eyes glinted faintly, reflecting the weak beam of her flashlight. It didn't move, but its breathing grew louder, ragged and guttural. Sarah backed away, her hand fumbling at the door. It wouldn't budge. The figure rose slowly, its movements jerky, like a puppet pulled by unseen strings. It was tall, too tall, and its limbs seemed to stretch longer with every second. The breath came again, raspy and wet. Sarah banged on the door, her voice cracking as she shouted for help. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, its hollow eyes locked onto her. She screamed as the room plunged into darkness. Sarah's scream echoed through the blackness, swallowed up by the oppressive silence that followed. Her flashlight was dead now, no comforting beam to cut through the pitch dark. She fumbled with it, slapping the casing and twisting the handle, but nothing worked. The room felt smaller than it had moments before, the air thicker, pressing against her like a damp, heavy shroud. She stumbled back until her hand brushed the wall behind her. The surface was cool, almost damp, and seemed to tremble under her palm. Somewhere in the shadows, that rattling breath still sounded, closer now. Suddenly, there was movement, a faint shuffle, the creak of wood. Sarah froze, her every nerve screaming for her to run. But where would she go? Her fingers slid along the wall, searching desperately for a doorframe or a latch. As her eyes adjusted, she thought she saw the faintest glimmer of light in the distance, just a pinprick, but enough to pull her attention. Her heart pounding, she edged toward it. The soft glow flickered faintly, unevenly, like a candle struggling against a draft. As she moved closer, she realized it wasn't coming from the room at all, but from a staircase leading down. The cellar. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and stopped at the top of the steps. The light seemed to beckon her, growing brighter, as if inviting her down into the depths. The air grew colder, carrying a scent that made her stomach churn earthy, wet, and metallic, like rusted iron and decaying wood. She didn't want to go. Every instinct told her to stay where she was, to find another way out. But there was no other way. The walls behind her seemed to close in, and the oppressive silence was now punctuated by that faint scratching sound again. Her options were to face whatever was upstairs, or descend into the unknown. With shaking hands, she gripped the railing, its wooden surface splintered and damp. The first step groaned under her weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. She winced, waiting for something, anything, to respond. When nothing did, she took another step, then another. Each creak seemed to echo, as if the house were announcing her descent. The light grew brighter with every step, though the stairs themselves seemed to stretch endlessly downward. It didn't make sense. She should have reached the cellar floor by now. Instead, the walls seemed to stretch farther apart, the temperature dropping further. Her breath came out in visible clouds, and she felt her fingertips going numb. At last, her boots touched solid ground. The light was coming from a lantern resting on a table in the center of the room, its flame low and flickering. The cellar was vast, far larger than the house above. The ceiling arched high, the beams sagging under the weight of time. Rows of shelves lined the walls, their contents hidden under layers of dust and cobwebs. Old crates and barrels sat haphazardly around the room, their lids broken or missing, revealing dark, empty interiors. She stepped toward the lantern, drawn to its faint, golden glow. When she reached the table, she hesitated. Beside the lantern lay a collection of objects, a pair of shears, rusted and stained, a small, cracked mirror, and a book bound in what looked like aged leather. The book's cover was blank, the material worn smooth in places. It radiated a faint, unpleasant warmth, as if it were alive. Sarah reached out, her fingers hovering just above the surface. She knew she shouldn't touch it. She knew nothing good could come from opening that book. But her hand lowered slowly, as though something unseen were pulling it down. The moment her fingers brushed the cover, the lantern flame flickered violently, almost extinguishing. She gasped and jerked her hand away, but it was too late. The air in the cellar shifted, the chill deepening to an icy bite. The scratching sound began again, louder, closer. It was coming from the walls this time, or no, from the crates, from everywhere. It surrounded her, filling the space with a grating, relentless noise. The lantern went out. Sarah spun around, her heart racing as she clutched at the table. She couldn't see a thing. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. She stumbled back toward the staircase, her hands stretched out in front of her. But where the stairs should have been, there was nothing. Just empty air. She turned back toward the table, the objects now completely invisible in the blackness. A new sound joined the scratching, the faintest whisper, low and guttural. It was speaking words she couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, commanding. Sarah's knees buckled, and she dropped to the ground, covering her ears. The whispering grew louder, surrounding her, echoing through the cavernous cellar. She felt the floor shift beneath her palms, as if something was crawling just beneath the surface. And then all at once it stopped. The scratching, the whispers, everything fell silent. Sarah stayed where she was, frozen in place. The air was so still it felt heavy. She dared not move, her heart hammering so loudly she thought it might echo off the walls. In the silence, a faint breath brushed past her ear, cold and rasping. She screamed and scrambled to her feet, her hands groping through the blackness until they found the staircase. The steps creaked and groaned as she bolted upward. She didn't stop until she reached the top, bursting back into the hallway. The door at the top slammed shut behind her, but she didn't look back. She ran blindly down the corridor, not knowing where she was going, only that she had to get as far from the cellar as possible. The sound of her own frantic breathing filled her ears, drowning out the silence of the house as she plunged deeper into its shadowed halls. Sarah stumbled forward, desperate to put as much distance as possible between herself and the cellar door. The hallway seemed to twist and lengthen as she ran, the floorboards uneven underfoot. She gripped her dead flashlight in one hand, holding it like a talisman, and fought the urge to look behind her. She wasn't sure what she'd see, but she was certain she didn't want to know. The silence had returned, an awful suffocating stillness that made her ears strain for any hint of noise. Her heart hammered as she tried to orient herself. The layout of the house made no sense. What should have been the main corridor, leading back toward the entrance, now stretched endlessly. Doors lined the walls, each shut tight, some padlocked, others barely hanging on their hinges. The air was thick, damp, and metallic, and she had the feeling she was being funneled somewhere. She paused for a moment to catch her breath. The hall stretched on both sides, indistinguishable, its ends disappearing into darkness. Ahead, one door stood ajar, faint light spilling through the crack. Her breath caught. She knew she shouldn't go inside, but it was the only visible landmark, the only sign of anything that wasn't endless corridor. With nowhere else to turn, she approached it. The room beyond the door was circular and far larger than it should have been. It reminded her of an old stone chapel, though the walls were bare and stained with dark streaks. Symbols were etched into the floor in a chaotic, sprawling pattern, their lines jagged and uneven. Sarah's stomach churned as she stepped into the room. The faint light came from a series of candles arranged in a ring around the edge of the space. The flames flickered without any apparent draft, their glow casting long, writhing shadows that seemed alive. In the center of the circle was a low, rough altar made of blackened wood. On it lay an open book, bound in what looked disturbingly like stretched leather. Beside the book were objects she didn't want to examine too closely, something gleaming and metallic, something wrapped in a crimson-stained cloth. The air was colder here, and it carried a strange hum that she felt more than heard. The symbols on the floor seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. Sarah hesitated at the threshold, every fiber of her being urging her to turn back. Yet her feet moved forward. She tried to resist, but her body felt distant, like a puppet being dragged toward the altar. Her legs trembled as she crossed the threshold into the circle of candles. The air was heavy here, pressing down on her shoulders, and the humming grew louder with every step. When she reached the altar, she couldn't help but glance at the open book. Its pages were filled with the same jagged, looping symbols she'd seen on the papers in the study. Only now, they seemed to shift and writhe on the page. She tried to tear her gaze away, but her eyes refused to look elsewhere. Words began to form, written in crimson, appearing letter by letter as if an invisible hand was carving them into the parchment. "You are chosen, Sarah. You must complete the rite." Her breath hitched. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, I didn't choose this." The candles flared brighter, their flames turning an unnatural green. The hum turned into a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the stones beneath her feet. The symbols on the floor pulsed faster, brighter, and she felt an awful pull, like hands grabbing at her chest, her arms, her very being. "Leave me alone," she pleaded, backing away from the altar. But she couldn't step outside the circle. The invisible force holding her there was too strong. The symbols flared one last time, then faded to nothing. The candles snuffed out simultaneously, plunging the room into darkness. In the silence, she heard a faint voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear, low, and resonant. "It is too late." A violent wind surged through the room, pushing Sarah to her knees. The floor beneath her shifted, and she felt the unmistakable sensation of something moving just below the surface. Something vast, something alive. She clawed at the floor, desperate to get away, but there was no escape. The voice came again, louder this time, echoing in her mind. "The rite has begun." Suddenly the walls seemed to fold inward, the space around her warping. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was the altar, now empty, before the room collapsed into blackness. Sarah's breath hitched as she was thrust back into the hallway. The air was heavy, as though it was pressing against her chest. She scrambled to her feet, looking around in confusion. The altar, the book, the chanting voices, all gone. But the house wasn't the same. Something had changed. The walls no longer felt like mere walls. They seemed alive, pulsing faintly, the faded wallpaper rippling like flesh. The floors creaked underfoot, not just from her steps, but in random intervals, as though the house was adjusting itself, shifting its weight. Shadows flickered and danced along the walls without any light source. Her flashlight still wouldn't turn on, and she dropped it to the floor. It clattered, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and her thoughts spiraled. Had she lost track of time? Was the house playing tricks on her mind? Or was it something worse, something she didn't want to name? Then she heard it. A low, guttural groan echoed through the hall. Not a human sound, not something mechanical. It was deep and wet, like the sound of old wood bending under tremendous pressure. Sarah stumbled back a step, the floor beneath her feet feeling more like soft, damp soil than wood. The hallway in front of her began to stretch, twisting at angles that didn't make sense. The corners of the ceiling dipped and shifted as though the house were trying to fold in on itself. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to move. She had to get out. Every door she tried was locked, the handles cold and slick beneath her fingers. Her footsteps sounded louder than they should have, each one echoing as if the house was amplifying her every movement. She could feel it now. The house wasn't just changing, it was aware. It was reacting to her presence, growing more animate with every step she took. The air was thick and damp, heavy with the smell of rot and earth. Ahead, the hallway split into two paths. One veered left, leading into a darker corridor, while the other stretched out in front of her, the flickering light of a single rusted chandelier illuminating a crooked staircase. Sarah hesitated, her throat dry and her palms slick with sweat. That groaning noise came again, this time closer. The walls seemed to tremble, their pulsating surface shifting toward her like lungs inhaling deeply. She chose the staircase, racing up the warped steps as quickly as her shaking legs would allow. Each step felt like it might collapse under her weight, but she didn't stop. The groaning grew louder behind her, and now there were other sounds, scratching, tapping, whispers just on the edge of hearing. She reached the landing, only to find another corridor stretching out before her, its end disappearing into darkness. Her body felt heavy. Her muscles screamed at her to stop, to rest, but she knew she couldn't. Not with that sound behind her. Not with the house growing more alive by the second. The floor beneath her trembled, and she could swear she felt something shift under the surface, as if there were things crawling just beneath the floorboards. She ran, every instinct urging her forward, and then she saw it, a door. Different from the others, this one was wide open, revealing a room bathed in faint, cold light. The flickering glow was unnatural, almost bluish. Sarah paused, gasping for breath, as her eyes adjusted. The room inside was vast, far larger than it could have been. given the size of the house. Its ceiling arched impossibly high, supported by warped beams that twisted like tree roots. The floor was bare stone, covered in faint markings that glowed faintly as she stepped inside. The groaning stopped, the walls ceased their trembling, and the heavy air seemed to lighten slightly. Sarah stood frozen in the center of the room, turning in slow circles. The markings on the floor were the same jagged symbols she'd seen before, but here they seemed to form a larger, more intricate pattern. At the far end of the room, a shape emerged from the shadows. At first, she thought it was another piece of warped furniture or an oddly shaped column, but as the light shifted, it became clear. It wasn't furniture. It was something that didn't belong in this world, an amorphous, writhing form that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It had no clear shape, no eyes, no mouth, but it moved as though it were watching her. The glowing symbols flared brighter as it shifted, sliding forward with an unsettling fluidity. Sarah's body locked up, her feet refusing to obey as the thing came closer. The air grew colder again, and the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony that made her ears ring. "Run," the voice in her mind said, but she couldn't. She was rooted to the spot, staring at the impossible shape as it loomed over her. It paused, as if studying her, the glowing lines on the floor pulsing in rhythm with its movements. Sarah's breathing was shallow, her vision narrowing as the thing reached out, not with arms, but with the suggestion of limbs, curling shadows that stretched toward her. A single word echoed in the room, low and resonant, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mine. Her scream tore through the silence as the world around her twisted, the walls collapsing inward and the glowing lines swallowing her whole. The moment Sarah's scream faded, the room seemed to collapse in on itself. The glowing lines pulsed violently, and then the ground beneath her feet gave way. She fell not through empty air, but through something thick and clinging, as though the house itself was swallowing her whole. The walls closed around her, dark and wet, pressing against her from every side. The air grew colder still, burning her lungs with each gasp, and then suddenly she was back on solid ground. She opened her eyes to find herself standing in the front hall of Bellamy Manor. The massive door loomed before her, just as it had when she first entered. For a moment she thought she was free. She stumbled forward, her fingers brushing the cold brass handle. It turned easily, and the door creaked open. Outside was nothing but darkness. No trees, no path back to the village, just an endless black void that stretched on forever. The faint silhouette of the house's front gate floated impossibly far away, unreachable. Sarah stepped back, her breath hitching. She turned around, hoping to find another exit, but the hall behind her had changed. The walls were closer now, the space more like a tunnel than a room. The wallpaper, once just faded and peeling, now writhed as if alive. Shadows crawled across the surfaces, though no light remained. She tried to remember how she had come in, which doors she had passed, but everything was different. Doors led to nowhere, hallways looped back on themselves. The house had become a maze with no logic, no pattern. Her footsteps echoed as she moved, the sound no longer matching the rhythm of her steps. Each time she turned a corner, the whispers returned, quiet at first, but growing louder with every step. They called her name now, clearly, insistently. "Sarah, Sarah, stay with us." She broke into a run, but no matter how far or fast she went, the hallways stretched endlessly ahead of her. The house was alive. It wasn't just shifting or creaking, it was breathing, watching, waiting. Sarah tried every door she passed, but they were either locked, bricked over, or simply led her back to where she started. Her mind raced, desperate for a way out. She dropped the flashlight, useless in the complete dark. The only light came from the walls themselves now, faint and pulsing, as if the house's very veins carried a dim, flickering glow. As she ran, she heard it again, the low, guttural groan. The house was waking up. The whispers turned to laughter, mocking and cruel. Shadows moved ahead of her, closing off passages she thought she'd already come down. The very floor beneath her feet rippled and shifted, forcing her down new corridors that seemed to appear from nowhere. She was being funneled again, drawn towards something waiting for her. She reached a final door, different from the rest. It was old, ancient, its surface etched with the same jagged symbols she'd seen in the ritual room. It swung open without a sound, revealing a cavernous space beyond. The room was empty except for a single object in the center. a large mirror. Sarah froze in the doorway, her chest heaving, her breath visible in the frigid air. She recognized the mirror. It was the same one she had seen before, but now it was flawless, its glass smooth and clear, reflecting her perfectly. But as she took a step closer, her reflection didn't move. The Sarah in the mirror stood still, staring back with wide eyes. The longer she looked, the more she realized it wasn't just standing still. It was watching her, studying her. Its expression was wrong. The mouth was too tight, the eyes too hollow. Sarah backed away, but her reflection didn't retreat. It stepped closer to the surface of the mirror, its hands pressing against the glass as if it wanted to push through. "No," Sarah whispered. "This isn't real." The reflection smiled. Its lips moved, but the words didn't match her own. They came from the house, from the walls, from everywhere. "You belong to us now." The room began to tremble. The mirror rippled like water, and the reflection pressed harder, its distorted features stretching as though it was about to break free. Sarah turned to run, but the door had vanished. The walls closed in, the ceiling lowered. She screamed again, her voice lost in the cacophony of laughter and whispers. The last thing she saw was her reflection stepping through the glass, its arms outstretched. The house exhaled one final heavy breath, and the darkness swallowed her whole.